Hey everyone, welcome to Stat Chasing Week 10. If you're new to the show, this is where I go through some of the stats that I think are the most important for understanding what happened this past week and kind of set the foundation for all the week ahead in terms of looking at the various matchups and kind of looking at what we're going to be doing for all purposes of fantasy, whether it's dynasty, DFS, high stakes, whatever. This is kind of like the basic research that I think is, again, kind of the foundational research of the week for me. So sharing some of that with you guys. And the stats that I'm going to be looking at are from PFF, yards per route run, and targets per route run. I think targets per route run is especially useful for tight ends. We also have Ben Gretch's addition to this with weighted targets per route run, which adds air yards to this targets per route run formula. Kind of a per route run similar stat to Whopper. Whopper is Josh Hermsmeyer's statistic that uses market share of targets and market share of air yards, and is a really nice stat for understanding wide receivers in particular, their role within the offense, how big that role is. I get that stat from RotoViz. I also get air yard share and target share from RotoViz. I also get average depth of target, or ADOT, from RotoViz. That's an excellent stat for understanding how a receiver is being deployed, whether they're a deep threat, whether they're being deployed very, very shallowly, etc. From RotoViz, I also get the expected points stat. That is a stat that weights opportunities by the line of scrimmage. I find that especially useful for understanding running back workloads, because running backs getting those carries near the goal line is just so much more important than if they're getting carries, let's say just hypothetically from your 2-yard line. Then you'd have to go 98 yards to score there. So that's very hard to do. So that's pretty much the stats that I'm looking at. The other terms that I'll use come from Ben Gretch's work in stealing signals. The green zone as a term for the area of the field inside the 10-yard line. And then touches that come within the green zone, high-value touches, high-value carries, high-value targets, etc. Just emphasizing that portion of the field 10 yards and in from the goal line. I also get snaps data from Pro Football Reference. Couple shout outs here. At Change College does timestamps for these, so you can see in the description below or in the comments below, you can see timestamps for each team. So thank you to At Change College for doing that. Also, thank you to Steven Krupka, who's been doing a highlight video for each of these over the last few weeks. Should have shouted out Steven earlier. If you watched our listener league, he co-drafted with Pete for that. So very talented video editor at Ball Street FF. And then Sam Hoppin, who has been doing charts for Stat Chasing for a number of weeks now. These are excellent, excellent charts. I'll be pulling that up here. And so you can see this chart. I'll kind of talk through it. If you watched the show before, you know that these charts are just kind of for visual purposes as we go through. I'm not going to be spending a ton of time highlighting the chart. Want this to be something that people can listen to pretty easily. But if you're watching on the x-axis, we got target per route with a dotted line here right at 20%. If we're getting targets above 20%, that's pretty nice. But you also want guys who are getting targeted deeper downfield and are getting a lot of air yards. So that adds value. So this dot represents the size of the air yards, and then the air yards are listed. The air yard percentage is listed in parentheses here. DeAndre Hopkins, he took a week off from being in the spot we're looking for, but he's right back here this week. This is where we want to see kind of our elite wide receivers. He had a 59.7% air yard share this week. The y-axis here is routes per team dropback. So DeAndre Hopkins running a ton of routes, getting targeted at a high rate, and getting a bunch of air yards. That's the combination we're looking for. The combination that can be a little bit frustrating is the Larry Fitzgerald combination, where the guy is running a lot of routes, but not getting targeted at a high rate and not getting a ton of air yards to come with those. That's especially frustrating when there's someone else who could benefit more from those routes. This week, Andy Isabella isn't in the range that he usually is, but typically Andy Isabella gets targeted at a high rate. but doesn't run many routes. So this week he again didn't run many routes, but his target rate came down. So guys who are showing up in the lower route per team dropback range, but who are getting targeted at a high rate, kind of like where Dan Arnold is this week, can be pretty interesting if we have reason to think that they might get more playing time going forward. And with Dan Arnold, I think it's probably just a blip. You don't want to completely buy into guys popping on small samples. We have a larger sample of them not getting targeted at a high rate. All right, let's get into it. In Arizona, we had a true split backfield this week with Kenyon Drake getting 52% of the snaps. This was a season low, excluding the Seahawks game where he was injured. And then Chase Edmonds had 49% of the snaps, which was his highest mark of the year outside of the game, the two last games, which he was getting higher snap rate due to Drake's injury. So, you could argue that maybe this is going to be a split backfield going forward now that they've seen what they have in Chase Edmonds a little bit more. But it's also, I think, probably more likely that Kenyon Drake is working back to full health, yet to consolidate his old role. The expected points here was split fairly evenly as well. Drake had 9.8 expected points and performed 2.1 points over expectation. And he did get both green zone attempts in the game as well, only one total target. Edmonds had 7.5 expected points. He performed 3.2 points over expectation, did not get used in the green zone, however, and got 3 targets. So pretty similar in terms of the usage to what we were seeing before Drake's injury, where Drake was getting used around the goal line more. Edmonds was getting used as a receiver more. I'll note that Jonathan Ward and DJ Foster were both active in this game, but didn't get any offensive snaps. Still no Benjamin. Yeah, going forward, the takeaway here for me is that I think Drake's probably going to get more of his old job back. But if this were to stay like this, it'd be pretty bullish for Edmonds, who I think is the better running back, and getting him 50% of the opportunity or thereabouts would be pretty interesting. At wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, I covered, is right where we want to see elite wide receivers on this chart. And to get into some of the other numbers, he had a 38% target share, 55% air yard share by my numbers, 59.7 coming in on Sam's, maybe a target that wasn't counted or something. But a whopper, either way you slice it, just a huge game for Hopkins in the volume, a whopper of 0.95. He ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. Just a dominant alpha wide receiver week, one of the best game-winning catches of all time. Look, I mean, fantasy can be a tough game. If you ever feel burned about a trade that you made, just remember that a real-life, actual flesh and blood human general manager traded away this dude for David Johnson. Christian Kirk, a little bit of a disappointing week after a pretty strong run. I mean, he had been running really hot. I talked about it on the show that he was running really hot in efficiency, on per target efficiency, which is not something we want to chase. But then last week, he teased us a little bit with some actual nice volume to go with that. But yeah, it kind of fell off this week as Hopkins reemerged back into that alpha role. Kirk ran around on 85% of dropbacks. He had a 19% target share, an 11% air yard share, a 0.36 whopper. Oddly enough, used very shallowly this week with an 8 out of 3.8. That's not his typical role. Probably just a blip there. I would expect him to continue running pretty deep routes going forward. And this is kind of what you get with Christian Kirk. He's going to be a bit hit or miss. Larry Fitzgerald ran a route on 95% of dropbacks. Why? Why did he do that? By the way, these dropback numbers are also coming from PFF. So frustrating to see Larry Fitzgerald out there this much. Just at this point, I don't think it's going to change. I mean, it'll probably change when Larry Fitzgerald retires after the season, you would think. But, or maybe if he comes back, they finally scale back his role next season. But yeah, through the end of the season, there's really no reason to think that they'll adjust this. He had a 16% target share and a 15% air yard share. So, I literally use him as the example of what we're not looking for every week. And, no surprise, Larry Fitzgerald is just kind of taking up routes for other players. That other player would be Andy Isabella here. This was not a good week for him, only a 3% target share, 7% air yard share. He had a weighted target per route run of 0.31. So that's, again, Bed Gretsch came up with this stat. It takes target per route run and adds air yards. That weighted target per route run did tie with Kirk and was better than Larry Fitzgerald. So, he probably would have added more to the offense had he gotten those Fitzgerald routes. But that's also not a good weighted target per route run. So it's not like there was some great week for Isabella had he run a route on more than 23% of dropbacks. This was going to be a DeAndre Hopkins week, I think, regardless. At tight end, Dan Arnold ran a route on 49% of dropbacks. He had a 12% target share, an 8% air yard share. He had a target per route run of 21%, which is pretty good for a tight end, and especially good for an Arizona tight end where we just haven't seen them get targeted at a high rate all season, no matter who's been running the routes. But yeah, I think this is basically a spike week for an Arizona tight end, and this is what counts for a spike week in Arizona at the tight end position. In Baltimore, J.K. Dobbins played 44% of the snaps, which led the backfield. However, he was third in expected points. He only had 4 expected points. He was inefficient as both a rusher and a receiver, leaving 1.6 points on the field. It's not a huge deal. Dobbins has looked really, really strong this year, but it's not going to help him in the short term because he needs to get a much, much bigger share of this backfield to really deliver value. Gus Edwards had 23% of the snaps. That's third in snaps, but he led the backfield in expected points, getting the most work when on the field. He had 6.9 expected points. He added 1.4 points in efficiency. He didn't actually convert his green zone carry, the only green zone carry in the backfield this week. And 6.9 expected points, although it did lead the backfield, is basically like a backup level workload. So just not a lot of value to go around, and it was split 3 ways, actually 4 ways as we'll get to. Mark Ingram had 26% of the snaps here, second in snaps and second in expected points with 4.8. He performed right at expectations. And then Justice Hill involved. We do not need Justice. Justice had an 8% of the snaps, just 8% of the snaps, but 2 expected points, left 0.7 of those on the field, had a green zone target. It's only 2 expected points, but we just don't need it. We don't need it because it's already split 3 ways, and there already wasn't that much value here to begin with. So this is really, at this point, a backfield that you can't trust. It's easy to see who would be valuable. It's J.K. Dobbins. Based on what we've seen this season, J.K. Dobbins, I think, clearly the most talented running back in this backfield, but needs to get a much bigger slice of this, needs like 2 of these guys to go away. At wide receiver, Marquise Brown, he ran, I forgot to write up notes here, it looks like, for these guys, but I can go off the chart. Marquise Brown had 40.9% air yards, and he ran around on nearly 100% of dropbacks. Not targeted at a particularly high rate. Willie Snead was targeted at over 20% here, had 28.2% of the air yards, got in the end zone a couple times. Willie Snead just kind of continues to steal value. Devin Duvernay was out there a fair amount, the clear wide receiver, out there on over 60% of dropbacks. Had 6.2% of the air yards, though, so not heavily involved. Didn't get targeted at a high rate either, just over 10% of targeted on just over 10%. Sorry, had over just 10% of the targets. And then Miles Boykin is basically, he was not targeted in this game. He did run some routes, but he has just completely been phased out of this offense. So it's really these 3 wide receivers. Nick Boyle, he suffered a season-ending injury. And then Mark Andrews, I think partly as a result, ran around on 83% of the dropbacks. Boyle had been cutting into Mark Andrews' routes for some time. And so to see Andrews up here at 83%, it probably has, like I said, something to do with Boyle getting hurt. However, Andrews had 3 previous weeks of this season over 80%, so it's not necessarily entirely due to that. Andrews had a pretty strong week with 26% target share, 19% air yard share, a whopper of 0.53, and a 27% target per route run. Still not very efficient, unfortunately. Looking more like Zach Ertz than George Kittle this year, just not hitting that per target efficiency over many weeks now, like 4 or 5 weeks where he's been disappointing in that. However, the volume with Nick Boyle out now is probably going to be a little bit more consistent. I think they will bring up a tight end from the practice squad. It's unclear who that will be. Either Sean Culkin or Xavier Grimble is what RotoWorld is reporting. But my guess is that they do bring up a tight end, that they do run a fair amount of 2 tight end passing sets. But you have to think that Andrews will be able to draw targets at a higher rate compared to one of those guys. And then as we zoom out on the season, Mark Andrews only behind George Kittle and Darren Waller in weighted target per route run among tight ends. And he's only behind those 3 and Travis Kelce in whopper. So it does continue to be frustrating with Mark Andrews, but now more than ever with Nick Boyle out of the picture, got to keep the faith with Mark Andrews. Marquise Brown, I think, is getting a little bit harder to keep the faith with. Is seeing a lot of those air yards, but I covered this last week. Not a ton of optimism about Baltimore finding a get-right spot in the regular season. Maybe it happens for them in the playoffs, but they don't face the right combination of teams, a team that's really going to challenge them to stay competitive and also force them to throw and play fast. So Marquise Brown, it's going to be a frustrating close to the season, I think, even though he still does have just a really nice role in terms of the percentage of air yards. Moving to Buffalo, Zach Moss had 53% of the snaps here. He had 6.1 expected points. He left 3.4 of those on the field, though. Didn't have any green zone opportunities, so this was actually not him failing to convert touchdowns. That's not what led to the inefficiency. He only turned 2 targets into 1 for -3. That helps explain some of it. Devin Singletary had 47% of the snaps. He had 9.5 expected points, so used less in terms of the snaps, but got more of the workload. However, he left 7.5 points on the field this week. Really, really bad. Also 0 green zone opportunities. He had 5 targets. He had 1 catch for -5 yards. So again, that kind of lets you know why there was so much inefficiency this week. Same basic roles here where Devin Singletary is going to be more the receiver, but this isn't an offense that throws a ton to the running backs. Zach Moss is going to be more the goal line guy, but this is an offense where the quarterback steals touchdowns. So it's just going to be a tough backfield to rely on unless it consolidates to one running back. If forced to start one of these guys, I would take Moss just based on the chances of him scoring a touchdown. This is not an offense where I want the receiving back. Normally, I would probably lean towards the receiving back, but this offense hasn't really provided much value for receiving running backs at all. At wide receiver, Stephon Diggs ran around on 98% of dropbacks. He had 23% target share, 21% air yard share, a whopper of 0.5. Not a dominant game from Diggs, but not a bad game either. You see him on the chart here, right on this line. The bubble kind of in the middle here, but running a ton of routes. So, just not the ultimate Stephon Diggs game that we were, kind of hoping for here. But on the season, a whopper of 0.67, which is still very strong. So I think better things ahead for Stephon Diggs. It's been kind of interesting. His whopper has cooled off a little bit as John Brown has come on a little bit more. But John Brown tweaked his ankle in this game. Keep an eye on his practice reports. He ran around on 71% of dropbacks, partly due to that ankle. Had a 17% target share, 31% air yard share, a whopper of 0.47, a 14.1 ADOT. One of the things that I've noticed with Brown is that his ADOT seemingly was increasing with his health. When he first came back, he had like an ADOT of like 2 or 3, where he was just kind of catching wide receiver screens and it wasn't really getting targets deep. And then it was kind of a mix of that. And then this week, That 14.1 ADOT is sort of that true deep threat ADOT that we would expect from John Brown. So he probably was pretty close to full health here, but now obviously a bummer as he tweaks that ankle again. We'll have to see what his outlook is going forward. Cole Beasley, 80% route run rate, 28% of the targets here, 26% of the air yards. He had a whopper of 0.59, like a borderline wide receiver one whopper this week. A 7.2 ADOT, used shallowly but not crazy shallowly. He had 13 targets in this game, peppered over the middle with these targets. He has a 2.14 yards per route run this season, which, is good. So, yeah, he's not the most exciting wide receiver, but Cole Beasley can play. He's got a quarterback who's taken a step forward. He's got an offense that's taken a step forward with Stephon Diggs. I think he's the type of guy that can take advantage, either when John Brown's out and there's targets to be had, or if the matchup sets up for the middle of the field to be the part that's really getting exploited, then he can have pretty nice games. He's basically like peak Hunter Renfrow. Like, I don't want to get too excited, but I feel like Cole Beasley probably gets a little underappreciated, and he had a really nice game in this one. Gabriel Davis ran around on 49% of dropbacks, just 6% of the targets, 9% of the air yards. Weighted target per route run of 0.31, which isn't terrible, but it's not great either. Could get some more run, though, in the coming weeks. So, again, the John Brown situation will be one to monitor. Isaiah McKenzie here, he threw a touchdown to Josh Allen on a trick play, but only ran a route on 6% of dropbacks. He's been kind of involved, stealing touchdowns one way or another, but not really actually all that involved in the offense when you look at the underlying numbers. At tight end, Tyler Kroft missed this game due to being a close contact to someone who tested positive for COVID. So Dawson Knox kind of got this all to himself here. He ran around on 55% of dropbacks, had a 14% target per route run, which is not good, an ADOT of 0.7. So you can continue ignoring Dawson Knox. You see, when you have an ADOT less than a yard, you're not going to get many air yards. He had just 0.5% of those. Moving to Carolina, Mike Davis, he had 52% of the snaps, missed some time with a dislocated finger, but returned to the game. 11.4 expected points, left 3 of those on the field, had 1 green zone attempt, had 5 targets. I still think he's got a valuable role. It's getting frustrating with Davis, but it looks like McCaffrey's going to miss again. So Davis, if you have him, you're starting him. And I'm not sure about DFS, but certainly the role is there, even though he's failed a few times here, failed more often than not in the last few chances. Rodney Smith was involved a bit here with Davis going out with the finger injury. He had 19% of the snaps, 2.8 expected points, left 0.3 of those on the field. He had 0 special team snaps, and then came in with 19% of the offensive snaps. So I think he's the backup to Davis for what that's worth. Could be, a deep dynasty stash. Mike Davis is a free agent after the season, so it's possible that Rodney Smith ends up being in that Mike Davis role next year. Trenton Cannon, he only had 10% of the snaps, just one expected point, and left 1 of those on the field. So 0 points for Trenton Cannon. At wide receiver, DJ Moore ran around on 94% of dropbacks. He had 25% of the targets, 58% of the air yards, 16.3 ADOT. So again, back to that really high ADOT deep threat role. He had a whopper of 0.78. That's like an elite wide receiver 1 whopper. So finally, this high ADOT paid off. The big week went 7 for 96 and a touchdown. On the chart here, showing up in that alpha wide receiver zone. Would like to see this more weeks. Have not had this many weeks. This was nice. Robbie Anderson, he ran around on 76% of dropbacks. Interesting to see him almost 20% below Moore here. 21% of the targets, 33% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.55, which is also a pretty strong week. They almost kind of reversed in terms of the whopper. Typically, if a guy was going to have a 0.78 whopper on Carolina this season, it would be Robbie Anderson. And DJ Moore, that 0.55 whopper is kind of where he's been at, right around there all season. So they basically swapped a little bit in terms of the volume. But as I've been kind of defending DJ Moore's volume this season when he's been kind of the secondary role or the 1B, I'll defend Robbie Anderson's volume, 0.55, still pretty strong week. Robbie Anderson has a 0.67 whopper on the season, a 2.28 yards per route run this season, which is very good. DJ Moore is at 0.58 now for the season in terms of whopper, and a yards per route run of 2.06. That's also good. So both these guys are getting strong volume, and they're also both playing very well. I think it's obviously going to matter here if Teddy Bridgewater ends up missing some time. He may not. Keep an eye on that. Hopefully, either way, the offense can keep rolling. Curtis Samuel ran around on 76% of dropbacks. He had 18% of the targets and 10% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.34. In 8 out of just 4, he had been being used a little bit more downfield recently, but much more shallow this week with DJ Moore, the primary deep threat on the week. At tight end, Ian Thomas had a route run on 67% of dropbacks, just a 5% target per route run. That's really, really gross and actually not uncommon for Ian Thomas. He continues to be someone you can completely ignore. Colin Thomas scored a touchdown this week. He had 1 target on 4 routes. I would like to see Colin Thompson. I have no idea what his deal is, or I don't know really anything about him, but I would like literally anyone else to get run over Ian Thomas here. Ian Thomas has been running a ton of routes all season, cannot get targets. It's good for Curtis Samuel, Robbie Anderson, and DJ Moore. I have a lot of DJ Moore, so in that sense, I'm perfectly happy with Ian Thomas. But tight end, as barren as it is, Ian Thomas is just kind of wasting a starting tight end role in the NFL. At Chicago, Foles here had a scary-looking injury in this game, but it looks like it was just a hip pointer. They were worried he might have fractured his hip, so luckily he avoided that, and looks like he'll be all right going forward. At running back, Cordarrelle Patterson, he had 50% of the total offensive snaps. Obviously not a pure running back, but 10.7 expected points, 2.1 points over expectations. Also had a return touchdown. Does look like the play here if Montgomery ends up missing again. Ryan Nall had 34% of the snaps, 3.1 expected points. Left 0.3 points on the field. But the more important thing here is the workload just being really small. 3.1 expected points is like a true backup level workload. Artavis Pierce here played on 12% of the snaps. He had 1.5 expected points. Left 0.6 on the field. Lamar Miller had 10% of the snaps. Rotoviz doesn't have him in the database yet, but he had 0 carries. He had 2 targets, which he turned into 2 for -6 for 6 yards. Excuse me. So he didn't do much and didn't get much opportunity either. At wide receiver, Allen Robinson, he had a really nice week here, as you can see on the chart, with 97 running around on 97% of dropbacks, 33% target share, 35% air yard share, a whopper of 0.75, kind of a strong, clear wide receiver 1 week. 8 out of 9.1, fairly nice 8 out depth, a little bit of an intermediate depth usage this week, which is nice. He did not have a strong week, though, or at least left a lot of it on the field in the box score with a yards per target of 4.8. So the usage was really exciting. Could have had a really nice week, but didn't quite come together for fantasy purposes. Darnell Mooney ran around on 89% of dropbacks, had 7% of the targets, 0% of the air yards, 0.4%, as you can see on the chart here, an 8 out of 0.5. So struggled to get targets this week. Don't love when you have a deep threat small wide receiver with an 8 out of 0.5. That obviously is going to be a red flag. But he still looks locked in as the wide receiver 2, running around on 89% of dropbacks is still very strong usage. Anthony Miller way further down. And Anthony Miller, as we know, plays the slot where Darnell Mooney's locked into one of those outside wide receiver roles, so he's not really even a threat to Mooney. Anthony Miller ran a route on 63% of dropbacks. He had 26% of the targets and 39% of the air yards. So a nice game from Anthony Miller, a whopper of 0.66, very strong. Yards per target, though, of 5.6. So that's bad. Obviously, that's bad. But it actually led all wide receivers here, pointing to the quarterback play being an issue, right? When you have a 5.6 yards per target leading the wide receivers, that's not good. Miller, I think, can play. But the concerning thing with Miller is that he's still falling short of a full-time role in the offense, just the 63% route run percentage here. He'd been trending up, getting closer to like the 80% range, but this is he kind of fell back down a little bit. Would like to see him up into the 70s at least. Otherwise, he's going to be a bit hard to trust given the quarterback play. At tight end, Cole Kmet. Cole Kmet is the starting tight end based on this week in Chicago. He had 51% route run, took over from Jimmy Graham here, who ran around on only 43% of dropbacks. Cole Kmet did not play particularly well. He only got targeted on 11% of his routes and had 3.5 yards per target, which are both terrible numbers. But, the good news is that if you want to get Cole Kmet on your dynasty team or, whatever, I guess that's really the only reason you'd be interested in Cole Kmet. And that's the reason I keep bringing him up, is because I'm intrigued by him as a prospect. But no one's going to have noticed that he took over as the tight end one here because he played badly. But I do think it's important to note that he did run more routes than Jimmy Graham here. Could be a nice sign for what's to come. Jimmy Graham, he only had a 7% target per route run and didn't catch either of his targets. So hopefully, Graham's performance, which was even worse than Cole Kmet's, locks in this role change. In Cincinnati, Giovanni Bernard had 68% of the snaps, a 14.3 expected points workload. He had 5.6 points below expectations in this game. So left a fair amount on the field on a decently strong workload of 14.3 expected points. Samaje Perine had 25% of the snaps, had 4.8 expected points, 1.7 points over expectation, but kind of a backup workload here, even more than a 1B. Still enough work that it hurt Bernard, but not really enough work to be interesting. Trevion Williams was involved a little bit this week, got 8% of the snaps, 2.3 expected points, played right at expectation. He had been someone that I had been intrigued with earlier in the season, but clearly behind Samaje Perine. So even with Joe Mixon out, not really interesting. Gio did fail to convert on a green zone carry and a target. That's why he was so inefficient. But I do think he's still interesting against the Giants this week if Joe Mixon ends up missing again. At wide receiver, T. Higgins ran a route on 84% of dropbacks, 24% target share, 30% air yard share, a whopper of 0.57. He had an 8-out of 11.6, which is really nice, getting a lot of those intermediate targets, getting a nice mix of targets with that type of usage. And at this point, T. Higgins is emerging as the primary option here. And this is happening so early into his career that it's just so exciting. I think he's profiling like a potential superstar at the wide receiver position. T. Higgins was a guy that was not particularly high on coming out, but we talked about this. We just weren't sure about the production because Clemson took him off the field a fair amount. They were just so good. So when you're looking at like market share numbers, T. Higgins did not pop, but he is a true underclassman wide receiver. And if we think that, basically he would have produced a lot of production, had a high market share of yards at a different school, then he would have just been popping in all of the models and the stuff that we like to look at for these wide receivers. So basically, I think he had a really wide range of outcomes as a prospect, and it looks like he was on the high end of that range. When you look at Justin Jefferson, some weeks he plays better than Adam Thielen, but he's basically the wide receiver 2 in his offense and just a really, really strong wide receiver 2, or he's the wide receiver 1B, I guess. But I think that Higgins by the end of the season might be the most clearly established wide receiver 1 on his team of any of these rookies. We'll have to see. there's a couple other contenders, but just really excited about Higgins going forward. Tyler Boyd, he had a route run on 84% of dropbacks, 21% target share, 19% air yard share, a whopper of 0.45. He had an 8 out of 8, more of an underneath type of role. I think he looks like the future wide receiver 2 to Higgins' wide receiver 1. Higgins kind of the more classic outside wide receiver and that nice kind of intermediate target depth that really yields fantasy goodness. AJ Green, he ran around 80% of dropbacks. He had 13% of the targets and 26% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.38. He had an 8 out of 17.8. I like this role for Green. I like that he's getting used super deep now. It just makes sense, right? Because if he hauls in a target, then it adds value. You have these high variance targets. When he goose eggs on 5 targets like he did this week, at least it keeps the defense honest, right? So I like this. Keep running AJ Green real deep. Keep T. Higgins in the intermediate area of the field. Tyler Boyd works best underneath. It all makes sense. Drew Sample at tight end. He ran around on 73% of dropbacks, but targeted on just 6% of his routes. He's Ian Thomas in orange. You can ignore Drew Sample. In Cleveland, Kareem Hunt. He played on 58% of the snaps here. He had an expected points workload of 14.5, 1.7 points added to that in efficiency. Didn't convert his 1 green zone attempt. He also had 4 targets. Pretty strong workload for Kareem Hunt, considering that Nick Chubb was back, and a pretty strong snap percentage in particular, playing well ahead of Nick Chubb with 58% of snaps to Nick Chubb's 43%. Nick Chubb had an 11.6 expected points workload, had 7 points over expectations, and would have had more than that had he not stepped out on that long run where he could have had a second touchdown. Obviously, that was super frustrating for his owners. He did convert his 1 green zone attempt for a touchdown, had a total of 1 target. That did not come in the green zone, just a normal target there. Chubb looked like his old self here, which is to say one of the best rushers in football easily. But, on the wrong end of the committee this week, I'd say, even if he flips expected points with Hunt and gets that 14.5 expected points, still a little bit of a fragile option there with that workload being good but not great. So the thing with Chubb is that he is very good. He's a good bet to, add efficiency to his workload. But this was a nice week where both guys paid off. Chubb could have paid off in a really big way on the split workload, but the split workload is still a little bit concerning for me. At wide receiver, Jarvis Landry, he ran around on 82% of dropbacks, had a 26% target share, 33% air yard share, a whopper of 0.63, which is pretty nice, 8 out of 11. So, not just kind of the total underneath option that Landry has been at times in his career. Rashard Higgins, he was actually a deep threat in this game with an 8 out of 16. He ran around on 77% of dropbacks, had 21% of the targets, 39% of the air yards, a 0.59 whopper. So kind of a 1A, 1B situation here. Landry at a 0.63 whopper this week, and Rashard Higgins at a 0.59 whopper. It'll be interesting to see. I should say Rashard Higgins is an interesting option here in better game environments, because with that 16 ADOT and with a target share of 21%, he could have some nice weeks. His 8 out on the season is 13.2, so it's not like this 8 out of 16 was coming out of the blue here. That's basically been his role, and he's helping to fill in for Odell Beckham, so it would make sense that he would be running deeper routes there as well. So it all kind of makes sense. It fits with what we expect going forward. He should be kind of the deeper threat wide receiver, but he's getting a nice target rate here, so he could be in for some really nice games, some big weeks, if Cleveland is forced to throw. We know they don't want to throw, though. We know they're very similar to Minnesota, where if they can run the ball down people's throats, they would like to. They have the personnel to do that. They've got the 2 elite running backs. But if there's a spot where they're going to have to throw, then Rashard Higgins, I think, is pretty interesting. Landry, obviously interesting as well, but Higgins kind of more under the radar. And obviously this game in particular was not one where you were going to see a ton of passing given the wind. Kadarius Hodge in this game, he ran around on 68% of dropbacks, was not targeted. So condensed offense to just Landry and Higgins here at wide receiver. I will note Donovan Peoples-Jones, he ran around on 14% of dropbacks, had 2 targets, which was good for a 67% target per route run. You see him all the way on the chart. Way, way, way over here. This is like what I'm talking about. I would be interested to see Donovan Peoples-Jones get more routes. He played well when OBJ went down. Then in the game after that, he really wasn't used at all. And in this game, he also wasn't used very much, but did get those 2 targets. Certainly would like to see him on the field over Kadarius Hodge, who couldn't get a target on 68% of the dropbacks. Like, that's pretty gross. So keep your eye on Donovan Peoples-Jones. I think he should be stashed, and if there's any dynasty leagues where he was dropped or anything, you got to stash him. I think even in shallow leagues, he's kind of a sneaky pickup if you have the space. At tight end, Austin Hooper ran around on 82% of dropbacks. He had a 6% target per route run, not good. Harrison Bryant ran around on 36% of dropbacks, was not targeted. So obviously terrible week here for the Cleveland tight ends, but gross game environment for both passing offenses with the weather. Wouldn't take too much away from this. We know they do generally like to throw to the tight end. This is probably a blip here. Although, you could say the same for maybe the offense being so condensed to the 2 wide receivers had something to do with the tight ends not being involved at all. So maybe I was too bullish on my assessment of the wide receivers if we expect the tight ends to come back way above where they were this week, which I generally do. In Denver, Melvin Gordon played 56% of the snaps. He had 9.5 expected points, left 4.9 points on the field. Not good. Left like more than half of his workload on the field in inefficiency. Had a green zone target, didn't convert that. That was the only green zone opportunity for the entire backfield. Phillip Lindsay played 30% of the snaps, just a 3.2 expected points workload, and left he had a 3.4 expected points workload and left 3.2 points on the field. So I left, left all but 0.2 points on the field here. Less opportunity than Gordon and Royce Freeman this week, who had 4.2 expected points on just 14% of the snaps. Freeman actually played well. He had 0.4 points added to his workload, but, just not leaving basically all of his points on the field was enough to be by far the best running back in Denver this week. That said, we really don't need this to be a 3-way split here with both Lindsay and Gordon not playing particularly well. Particularly Gordon continues to kind of be inefficient week after week. Overall, this is just a major stay away, this backfield. It's a 2 to 3-way split. We're not getting efficiency out of it. Just avoid it. At wide receiver, Jerry Jeudy ran around on 94% of dropbacks. He had an 18% target share, 34% air yard share, and 8 out of 16.9. This deep threat role for Jerry Jeudy continues on. It was that way when Tim Patrick missed, and then we weren't sure if he was going to keep getting all those air yards, and then he did last week, and now continues again with 16.9 true deep threat, ADOT, whopper of 0.5. That whopper isn't crazy high, but it's exciting overall to see Jerry Jeudy playing that Kenny Golladay, Julio Jones-ish type of role where you're a clear-cut deep threat, but also the primary option in the offense. Should lead to some big days going forward. Jerry Jeudy, one of those contenders to kind of establish himself as the clear wide receiver 1, although obviously this is happening with Courtland Sutton down for the year. KJ Hamler, he ran around on 92% of dropbacks. Last week, I noted that Hamler had a clear lead over Deshaun Hamilton in routes run for the first time and was nipping at Tim Patrick's heels. This week, he was decisively ahead of Tim Patrick, nearly more involved than Jeudy overall, led the team in targets. He had 22% of targets, 19% air yards. So Jeudy, 18% targets, but 34% air yards. Just completely different roles here with Jeudy at the 16.9 ADOT and Hamler with a 7.5 ADOT. Overall, though, the whoppers are similar. Jeudy had a 0.5 whopper, KJ Hamler with a 0.47 whopper. And you see Hamler here where we want our wide receivers, a little bit smaller of the air yards bubble, but getting targeted at a high rate, running a bunch of routes. Hamler starting to emerge here. Someone that you need to pay attention to, should be added in high stakes formats. Starting to emerge here is potentially the clear-cut wide receiver 2 in Denver. Tim Patrick ran a route on 57% of dropbacks, 13% target share, 15% air yard share, a whopper of 0.31. So took a step back here as Hamler took a step forward. Deshaun Hamilton, almost as involved as Patrick, ran around on 45% of dropbacks, 13% target share, 14% air yard share, a 0.3 whopper. Both of these guys, Hamilton and Patrick, had ADOTs right around 10. They basically looked to be splitting a role in the offense. They both had whoppers of right around 0.3. At tight end, Noah Fant ran around on 80% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 18%, which is solid. A 4.1 ADOT, though, which is a little shallower than we'd like, and a yards per target of 2.6, which is obviously god-awful. My guess is that Fant isn't fully healthy, but he did run a full slate of routes in this game. He's got this ankle issue that he's playing through. Hopefully he continues to get healthy and we see the targets per route run and the yards per target come back up. It's nice that at least he's still out there a lot. Drew Lock may miss week 11, so keep your eye on that. That would obviously be a hit to everybody. In Detroit, DeAndre Swift. This was a very exciting development this week. One of the most exciting developments of the entire week. He played 73% of the snaps, was named the starter prior to the game. Didn't know what to make of that, right? It's like he should have been the starter the whole time. So then they come out and say, yeah, he's going to be the starter. I kind of took that with a grain of salt, but they were telling the truth. Gave him 73% of the snaps, clearly ahead of Adrian Peterson and Kerrane Johnson, and it translated to the expected points workload as well. He got 15.2 expected points here. There were no green zone opportunities in this backfield this week. So I think that 15.2 expected points is, in a sense, even bigger than it looks, right? Because if you have a guy getting, let's say he gets stopped at the 2-yard line and he gets another carry from the 2-yard line and another carry from the 2-yard line. We saw this with Gus Edwards a few weeks back, or maybe last week. And, that's going to inflate your expected points workload because each one of those carries is adding expected points. But here we didn't get any of that. And so the workload is really coming from the fact that DeAndre Swift was just getting used like a workhorse running back. He had 16 attempts and 5 targets. If a few of those were in scoring position, he would have had an elite workload. So in a sense, I think the snaps are the more important data point here, the 73% snaps, which is borderline elite. The workload, which is pretty strong but not elite, I think the workload with a little bit of better circumstances would have been, could have been easily in the 20s, and that's an elite workload for running back. Of course, he did produce elite efficiency with 10.7 fantasy points over expectation, playing out of his mind. And you love to see this because this was his debut as the starter. So want him to just be playing out of his mind, wanting him to just be impressing the coaching staff here so they lock in this role change. I think that's what happened. I think we're going to get DeAndre Swift as a lead running back going forward here, and I'm really excited about it. Adrian Peterson had just 12% of the snaps, 3.2 expected points, clear-cut backup level workload. This is exactly what we want to see from Adrian Peterson. Kerrane Johnson had 15% of the snaps. He had just 0.5 expected points. Love to see that very, very low workload for Kerrane Johnson. All of that workload funneling to DeAndre Swift. That's all great. However, I don't love to see the 15% snaps for Kerrane Johnson. It was a season low, which is good, but I still think that's way too high. It opens up Swift to the type of week that we saw from Miles Sanders this week where, he gets sniped on a goal line carry or there's a long touchdown run that it goes to Kerrane Johnson, on just one of those carries. So it's not the type of thing where I love to see Kerrane Johnson still getting these empty snaps because sometimes those snaps don't end up being so empty. But at the same time, the more important thing is that the high percentage of the workload is going to DeAndre Swift, which is great to see. Clearly the most talented running back in this backfield. This week, by the way, DeAndre Swift gets Carolina. So could be entering a statement week. Moving to wide receiver, Marvin Jones had a really nice week. He had an alpha wide receiver week. You can check it out here on the chart. Ran around on 91% of dropbacks, had a 31% target share, 50% of the air yards, 50% of the air yards from Marvin Jones. 8 out of 11. So it came in kind of this intermediate depth type of role, not just a pure deep threat. That's kind of my preference. A whopper of 0.82. He had 10 targets, went 8 for 96 and a touchdown. Pretty strong week from Marvin Jones. I still think he's basically washed up, but, this week would say otherwise. So for whatever reason, you're a Marvin Jones truther, this was a nice week for you. Marvin Hall ran a route on 65% of dropbacks. He had 9% of targets, but 25% of air yards with the clear deep threat role of 18.3. He has really kind of taken over the Kenny Golladay role, but the Kenny Golladay role, the true Kenny Golladay role, is to be running a lot of deep routes and getting a lot of targets. And Marvin Hall can do one of those, but not the other. He gets enough targets to where I think he keeps the defense honest a little bit, which is nice, but he's just not that interesting on his own. He had a whopper of 0.32, not very good. A weighted target per route run of 0.44, which is better because he wasn't out there all the time. But he was splitting time with Quintus Cephas in this game, who was out there on 50% of dropbacks. He had 6% of the targets and 9% of the air yards for a whopper of just 0.15. So not a good week from Quintus Cephas in terms of actually getting targets, but did get a lot of playing time, and he continues to get on the field. I was thinking when Kenny Golladay went down that Marvin Hall would see a lot of playing time because he operates more as like a deep threat. And Cephas had played that deep threat role early in the season. It did not go well. But, yeah, they keep putting him out there a lot more than I would expect. If you have him on waiver wires in like medium depth dynasty leagues, I think he should be added. They seem to like him. I'm not sure exactly why they like him, but could have a bigger role as potentially some spots clear up in this offense in 2021. Danny Amendola, he ran around on 53% of dropbacks, had a whopper of 0.11. He had a 10-target game in week 9, but just 3 targets this week, -8 air yards this week. So not a very strong game at all from Danny Amendola after that strong week 9. Hopefully Kenny Golladay gets back here soon. I think that would be a huge boost to the offense overall. At tight end, TJ Hawkinson, he ran around on 62% of dropbacks, 19% target per route run, which is not bad. A whopper of 0.28, which is not very good, though, because he's not out there all the time. It is frustrating that he's not out there all the time. It could be poor coaching, but this is the week that they gave DeAndre Swift 73% of the snaps. So let's assume that the coaching has gotten much better. In that case, you'd have to chalk it up to this toe injury that he's playing through. He missed practice mid last week. Clearly not 100% health. Had a 3.3 yards per target in this game. That's not going to get it done. And the 19% target per route run is not bad, but it's not going to get it done when he's running this few of routes. So hopefully Hawkinson's health trends in the right direction here, and he can get out there more and play better on the routes that he does get. In Green Bay, Aaron Jones played on 63% of the snaps. He had a nice workload here of 15.1 expected points. Not elite, but still pretty solid. Left 0.6 of those on the field. Jamal Williams played on 48% of the snaps. He had a 9 expected points workload. Left 0.5 points on the field. Just watching the game, it felt like Williams was playing a ton in this game, and he was out there quite a bit. But Jones did lead in carries 13-8. He led in targets 6-4. Jones got the only green zone attempt in this game. So I think it's really came down to just Jones not having that elite efficiency that he often brings to the table, but he did get a solid workload. Obviously, losing 9 expected points is going to hurt, but that's kind of the Aaron Jones profile. We don't expect him to get, just 90% of the expected points or something. That's never really going to be the Aaron Jones role when Jamal Williams is healthy. But, Aaron Jones, he could have, if he had scored that touchdown, I think it would have been a different story. That's kind of what we're banking on with Jones to get those green zone opportunities and to have some high efficiency days. Williams, meanwhile, looks like a usable flex option. I think even with Jones back, the 9 expected points is obviously not great, but if you might be able to just plug him in if you need to. Tyler Ervin here, he was ruled out of the game with a rib injury, just played on 12% of the snaps. At wide receiver, Davante Adams ran around on 86% of dropbacks, 36% target share, 34% air yard share, a whopper of 0.78, a weighted target per route run of 0.78, which is really strong. Didn't run a full slate of routes in this game, but remained absolutely dominant in volume. 6.0 yards per target, so not his best game. Left some on the field. But, I mean, you see here on the chart, pure alpha this week, continues to be the clear wide receiver one in fantasy. Nothing has changed. He profiling, even in a bit of a down week, in some ways, still profiling like just a true elite wide receiver. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, he ran around on 97% of dropbacks, got 18% of the targets, 46% of the air yards, and 8 out of 15.8. This continues to be one of the most consistent roles in all of the NFL. He is just his 8 out is right around this 15, 16 range every week. He is the clear deep threat. He helps Davante Adams, I think, because he keeps the defense honest. He's not the best wide receiver in the league by any means, but he's good enough to where he can really punish defenses if they don't pay attention to him. He got a 0.6 whopper in this game, one of his bigger weeks of the season. A huge per target efficiency week, 24.8 yards per target. He's running really, really hot on per target efficiency over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, that's not going to keep up. But, the underlying volume here was actually pretty promising. So we'll have to see, could just be kind of a spike week with MVS, but similar to Christian Kirk, where he had been running hot on per target efficiency. Now he's getting a little bit of volume. So, now I'll probably buy into a little bit, and then the volume will disappear and go to Davante Adams, just entirely like we saw with the Cardinals this week. But we'll have to see. Still a bit of a bullish week for MVS. Equinemius St. Brown, he ran a route on 56% of dropbacks, but was not targeted. So this is a very condensed offense to these two wide receivers. However, Robert Tonyan has something to say about that a little bit. He ran a route on 69% of dropbacks, only targeted on 16% of his routes, which is not great. But at least he had a clear lead among the tight ends in routes run. There had been a three-way split here over the last few weeks between Robert Tonyan and the other guys, and he took more of a clear-cut lead role. He had an 8 out of 12 in this game, so although the 16% target per route run is not very strong for tight end, that 8 out of 12 is unusually high for a tight end. So by weighted target per route run, he had a 0.43, which is pretty solid. So looking stronger once you factor in the air yards for Tonyan. And just considering the state of tight end, looking like a solid option once again now that hopefully he continues to run more routes by a sizable margin than the other guys. In Houston, Duke Johnson played 95% of the snaps here. True workhorse, but only 8.4 expected points in just kind of a bad game environment. Left 3 of those on the field, did not convert his only green zone attempt. CJ Prosise was involved a little bit. He had 1.6 expected points, left half of that on the field, only 4% of the snaps. That was basically Cullen Gillespie had 2% of the snaps, which was just 1 snap. So it was basically really just Duke Johnson in this game. Duke Johnson had, he had the vast majority of opportunities and dominated snaps, as I mentioned. But he's got the Patriots and Lions next. So should be better game environments than what we got here just based on weather alone, you would think. Although, obviously, the Patriots' weather was not great either. But, the most important thing is that he's getting this huge snap percentage. So that can set him up for a really strong day if he gets a good game environment. At wide receiver, this is kind of hilarious if you look at the chart. These two, it literally looks like an eclipse, and that kind of sums up this passing offense here. These two guys are the co-wide receiver ones in this offense, and very, very, very similar days here. Will Fuller ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. Brandon Cook ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. Will Fuller had 29% of the targets. Brandon Cook had 29% of the targets. Will Fuller, though, was used deeper downfield and got 42% of the air yards to Brandon Cooks' 24. The ADOT for Fuller was 9.5 to 5.4 for Cooks, which explains the bigger volume. And Fuller had the better whopper as a result of 0.72 to 0.6 for Cooks. Cooks actually had the slightly better day in the box score, but Fuller had the better day from the underlying volume perspective. Bad game environment here. Both these guys looking poised for huge days if they get a better game environment. Very condensed offense overall. You've got all the running back snaps going to Duke Johnson, the wide receivers, really just these two guys. Randall Cobb, he did run around on 56% of dropbacks. He did have 18% of the targets, 23% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.43. That's not bad, but it doesn't have the upside, I don't think, of the two main options in Fuller and Cooks. At tight end, Jordan Akins had a target per route run of 17%, which is not terrible. However, only ran a route on 35% of dropbacks, and he lost a touchdown to fellow tight end Pharaoh Brown. Looking unplayable while Fells is also playing, and Fells not playable either. In Indianapolis, Nyheim Hines had a snap rate of 56%, a workload of 17.7 expected points, which is a very strong workload, an RB1 type of workload, and then added 10.8 fantasy points over expectations to that workload. He's getting a running back run workload with elite efficiency. It's a nice combo. Only running back in this game to convert a green zone opportunity. That was a green zone carry, by the way, not a target as you might expect given that it's Nyheim Hines. Super interesting, right? Like, I don't know how much we could take away from Nyheim Hines' usage, but, you know, he kind of profiles as like a poor man's Alvin Kamara, and that was the type of profile that we saw. We saw not the workload to the extent of Kamara, but still a very strong workload, and not the efficiency of Pete Kamara, but still, hey, 10.8 points over expected is a lot. Jonathan Taylor played on just 24% of the snaps. Better workload than you would expect, given that small snap percentage of 10.4 expected points. However, left 4.7 points on the field, did not convert 2 green zone attempts. Another poor day from Jonathan Taylor. This is getting pretty damn concerning. Jordan Wilkins had 20% of the snaps, 6.8 expected points, left 4 of those on the field. So, you know, Wilkins is obviously kind of the direct threat to Taylor, and being, you know, very similar type of player. Had a really bad day as well. He failed to convert a green zone target and green zone carry. So very, very similar kind of failure from Wilkins as we saw from Taylor. We'll have to see how the split breaks out going forward. But, you know, as of right now, I'd say Hines is the guy here over Taylor and Wilkins. At least the guy that I would be willing to take a chance with in my starting lineup right now. You know, and to that point, remember that the Colts never trailed by more than a touchdown in this game, and they ultimately won this game 34-17. So, you know, Ben Gretsch has talked a bit about this, how Frank Reich kind of dials up running backs for specific scripts, and obviously, you know, you would expect Nyheim Hines, given his role, to be more of the pass-catching guy, the guy that might blow up like this, get a ton of work in a game where they're throwing a ton, but you know, this was a game where they basically were never really down by more. They were never down by more than a touchdown. They win the game, and it ends up being a Nyheim Hines game. So, you know, at this point, you would say heading into this week that Jonathan Taylor's game script dependent. I think everyone would agree with that. But also, it's like he's just kind of looking luck dependent, right? He needs to convert one of those touchdowns. He needs to perform above expectations, because it's just tough to see how he gets the workload to where he's going to smash in an even week or even kind of return RB2 level value. So getting very, very frustrating with Jonathan Taylor. Nyheim Hines, though, looking kind of like an exciting guy for your zero running back teams where you got him. At wide receiver, Michael Pittman, emerging as the wide receiver 1 here, ran around on 95% of dropbacks, had 22% target share, 28% air yard share, a whopper of 0.53. And, you know, this is one of the few wide receivers in this class, Michael Pittman, that I didn't really like. You know, he not very athletic. He's big. He's a senior, wasn't productive. That's, you know, the size is nice, but that's basically all I had going for him outside of the draft position. And in this class, the draft position wasn't even that high because there's lots of other guys with great draft position, right? So I was probably maybe too low on Pittman, though, because he's starting to emerge as the wide receiver 1. in this offense. And this week played pretty well, had a yards per route run of 2.66. His yards per route run is only 1.49 on the season, which isn't very good. But if he's now emerging as the wide receiver one, if this kind of stays this way going forward, this is a big deal that, rookie wide receiver gets this big of a role right away, or at least halfway into the season kind of emerges. That's a big deal. And Michael Pittman might ultimately be a guy that we're talking about as being a stud from this class as well. T.Y. Hilton here ran around on 83% of dropbacks, 14% target share, 23% air yard share, whopper of 0.37. He had a yards per route run in this game of 1.21, which is not good, and he's at 1.24 for the season. I think he's washed. He's not getting targeted at a high rate. He was out there a lot, but I think T.Y. Hilton's pretty much done. Zach Pascal in this game ran around on 80% of dropbacks, 14% target share, 8% air yard share, a whopper of 0.26, 8 out of just 3. So, Zach Pascal, low volume guy, low upside guy. At one point, it looked like maybe he would kind of step in as the wide receiver one, but then recently his role has shifted to be kind of more this underneath type of guy, not running as many routes as he ran 80% this week, which is better than we had seen recently, but still Michael Pittman up there at 95%, the clear wide receiver one this week. So yeah, Pascal, low volume, low upside type of role. At tight end, Mo Alley Cox. We may have a new starting tight end here. Ran a route on 60% of dropbacks, only targeted on 13% of his routes, but hey, at least he led the tight ends in routes. I've kind of thought he's the most talented of these guys. Trey Burton was kind of the guy I was really touting as a pickup, and certainly that was paid off for a few weeks there. But without the Wildcat touchdowns, now not running as many routes as Mo Alley Cox, he had 48% of dropbacks in this one, and just a target per route run of 16% here. A little bit more shaky of a start than it looked like he might be. With Jack Doyle out in this game, you would think Trey Burton would be pretty reliable, but it ended up being Mo Alley Cox who played ahead. Moving to Jacksonville, James Robinson had 83% of the snaps here. The only other time where he was above 80% of the snaps this season was in Week 7, which Chris Thompson missed. He was at 90% of the snaps in that game. Chris Thompson left with an injury and only played 2% of the snaps, so basically not involved. And Chris Thompson is now on IR. So this is a big deal for James Robinson going forward. We could see him up in that 80% range, which is an elite snap share for running back. Dare Ogunbowale will be involved. He played 16% of the snaps in this game. And, he looks to be in a similar role to what Thompson adds to the offense, which is basically just passing down snaps without providing any fantasy value. But, he's on the field less than Thompson. So he's just a weaker version of Thompson, which is good for James Robinson. Dare Ogunbowale played 10% of the snaps in Week 7, which again was the game that Thompson missed, and 16% this week. So Thompson has been above 20% in every game, and every game that he's completed, and above 40% of snaps in 3 of 7 outings. So Thompson has this potential to get up above 40%. He did it 3 times. Dare doesn't. So Robinson looking much stronger here with Thompson swapped out for Dare. Thompson's absence should unlock some additional value for Robinson. Robinson does get the Steelers next, but he gets Cleveland and Minnesota after that. So things are looking up for Robinson here. He had 16 expected points in this game, left 2.8 points on the field, had multiple touchdowns, though, called back due to penalties. So it could have been a very big game for Robinson. I think even with Thompson out, he can be interesting against the Steelers, kind of a sneaky guy potentially. No green zone opportunities in this game. So similar to Swift, right, where I talked about how the workload may be almost understated, the potential that he had in that game because he didn't get work near the goal line, and particularly in Robinson's case where he had touchdowns literally called back. This 16 expected points maybe understates how much of a workhorse Robinson was in this game. So pretty exciting for Robinson as we move forward here. To the wide receivers, DJ Chark had a route on 97% of dropbacks, 15% target share, 29% air yard share, a whopper of 0.42. Keelan Cole ran a route on 89% of dropbacks, 21% target share, 15% air yard share, and a whopper of 0.41. And then Chris Conley ran a route on 89% of dropbacks, 24% target share, 19% air yard share, and a whopper of 0.49. So these guys were all clustered together in terms of their whopper. Conley actually had the highest. Shark had an ADOT of 12.6, while Cole was at 4.6 and Conley was at 5.1. So I think reasonable to think that Shark would have been the most affected by the wind that was affecting this game. As I mentioned, Jacksonville gets Pittsburgh next, so tough to trust pretty much anyone. But I would say that this game, potentially the weather makes it hard to take away. Shark's whopper was probably really hurt by the wind, I think. And so I'm not taking too much away from Cole and Conley being up higher than I would have thought and Shark being down here further than I would have thought, especially coming off that massive week from Shark last week in terms of the underlying volume. At tight end, Tyler Eifert ran a route on 74% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 14%. But the 74% route run is nice. At this point, he's kind of a dart throw option, just given the state of tight end and given that he's running a ton of routes. In Las Vegas, Josh Jacobs ran a route on he played 60% of snaps and had 17.5 expected points, 12.1 points over expectation. So he played great, got a really nice workload, although not an elite workload. He had 2 green zone attempts. He converted one of those. He added another touchdown from the 11. We know Josh Jacobs can play. Everyone agrees that Josh Jacobs can play, but he only got 60% of the snaps. That's pretty frustrating. Devontae Booker got 36% of the snaps, so he was the guy stealing that workload from Josh Jacobs, and he stole 9.9 expected points in this game. Even if Booker was down kind of where we expect backups to be and was down more at like 4.9 expected points, that's 5 additional expected points that we could have gotten for Josh Jacobs, right? That would have taken him over 20 expected points, 22.5 expected points. That's the type of workload that we want from Josh Jacobs in these game scripts. And instead, a lot of it is going to Devontae Booker, enough to hurt. Devontae Booker, though, playing well. He added 11.4 points over expectations. So he's adding more on a per touch basis than Josh Jacobs. So you can't really fault the Raiders for using Booker when he had that really nice touchdown run last week. Played really well again this week, converted a green zone attempt. He has 20.6 fantasy points over expectation over the last 2 weeks. Jacobs has 16.2 points over expectations over the last 2 weeks. So both guys are playing great, but I don't know that this split's really going to change, given that Booker is playing so great in this kind of keeping Jacobs' legs fresh type of role. The one silver lining here is that Jalen Richard was not involved in this game. Had just 4% of the snaps, 0 opportunities. However, this could be a game script thing, right? If they've been down, if they've been kind of in the 2-minute drill type of situation, then maybe Richard plays a ton. So, and I actually do think that's what would have happened. So Jacobs just continues to be frustrating because he's going to lose snaps, even though it feels like he shouldn't, given how strong of a player he's been. At wide receiver, Henry Ruggs ran a route on 85% of dropbacks, 18% target share, 28% air yard share, had a 15.2 ADOT, classic deep threat, as we would expect, although it would be nice if he got mixed in on some shorter stuff, some wide receiver screens, got some more intermediate targets. It's a little frustrating, his usage. He's a little pigeonholed. Whopper 0.47 here, which is solid. Nelson Aguilar ran a route on 78% of dropbacks, had an 18% target share, 21% air yard share, had an 11.2 ADOT, a whopper of 0.42. Hunter Henry, he ran around on 78% of dropbacks, had a 9% target share, a 3% air yard share, an ADOT of 3.5, a whopper of 0.16. So really nothing at a Hunter Renfrow. Did I say Hunter Henry? I meant Hunter Renfrow. Nothing out of him this week. Darren Waller, interesting sort of shift in his role this week. He ran around on 85% of dropbacks, which tied with Ruggs for the most. So, that's what we would expect. He's basically the wide receiver one on this team. Had a 23% target share, 36% air yard share, whopper of 0.59, which led the team. But the dynamic changed a little bit from what I highlighted last week. Last week I was talking about how Aguilar, Ruggs, and even Renfro last week were all running deep, and Waller was feasting on volume underneath. But this week we saw that Waller was actually running a bit deeper than usual. He was getting, with that 36% air yards, he was actually getting used more as a deep threat. So kind of interesting, and it resulted still in an elite tight end profile. Kind of no matter how it shakes out, Waller's probably going to be looking like an elite tight end week to week. Basically a wide receiver one who gets tight end designation. So obviously that's going to lead to a very strong tight end profile, particularly this season when we don't have many good options. Moving to the Chargers, Kalen Ballage here, he played 73% of the snaps, had 22.2 expected points, which is an elite workload. Okay, but Kalen Ballage is not an elite player. He left 7 points on the field. He didn't convert 4 green zone attempts. He had 6 targets. He went 5 for 34. There's elite value in this backfield, but it's not happening. It's not turning into elite fantasy production. I think that will change when Austin Eckler gets back. Hopefully that happens soon. I really, really think that if we had the right running back in this backfield, it could be some major fantasy goodness. Joshua Kelly, I think his time has come and gone. His opportunity has passed. 27% of the snaps here, 4.3 expected points, left 2.2 of those on the field. He wasn't targeted in this game. He didn't convert his only green zone attempt. Very, very easily passed by Kalen Ballage. I just don't think it's happening for Josh Kelly. Troymaine Pope, talk about guys who it's not happening for. I don't really know why. He looked good, in the game before he got knocked out with a concussion. Played on special teams in this game. He was active, but 0 offensive snaps. So they are rolling with Ballage, it looks like. At wide receiver, Keenan Allen ran around on 92% of dropbacks, 22% target share, 20% air yard share, a whopper of 0.47. He had an 8 out of 6.6 in this game, which is a bit shallower than ideal. Got in the end zone, but overall disappointing day in terms of the volume. Still wide receiver 7 in whopper on the season, so nothing to panic about here. Mike Williams ran around on 81% of dropbacks, 16% air yard, 16% targets, 60% target share, 42% air yard share, and a whopper of 0.53. A 19.2 8-out, which is a bit deeper than ideal. So, would like to see Allen getting some more intermediate targets. Would like to see Mike Williams getting some more intermediate targets. Jalen Guyton, he ran around on 78% of dropbacks, 19% target share, 15% air yard share, and a whopper of 0.39. Interestingly, because he had been used as this field stretcher, a guy who has typically an 8-out of over 20, which is unusually high. He was used underneath in this game with an 8-out of 5.7. Keep your eye on this, see if it's a role change or just kind of a blip. At tight end, Hunter Henry ran around on 69% of dropbacks, had a targets per route run of 20%, 0.47 whopper, which is pretty solid, got in the end zone. So a nice solid day for Hunter Henry. It had been very frustrating over the last few weeks, but finally had a day that paid off a little bit. Moving to the Rams, this backfield came down to touchdowns this week. Malcolm Brown played on 41% of the snaps, had 9 expected points. He converted both of his green zone attempts, though, and therefore had 10.1 points over expectation. Also just kind of played well and had 2 targets here. Darrell Henderson had 33% of the snaps, 7.7 expected points. He had 2.6 points over expectations, converted his only green zone attempt, had 1 target. And then Cam Akers, he played 26% of the snaps, had 7.5 expected points, 3.7 points left on the field because he failed to convert 2 green zone attempts. And he was also not targeted. So some signs of life here for Akers with the 2 green zone attempts. I do like that he got them. Obviously didn't convert them, which is not great. But among running backs with 40-plus attempts, Cam Akers is running back 1 in elusive rating. He has played pretty well. He's ultimately likely to be a solid starting option at some point. I don't know if that's going to be in 2021. I don't know if that's going to be later this season, but I think at some point, Cam Akers is going to be a solid starting option. Looks like a pretty good buy low, particularly in Dynasty, where I think, at one point it felt like people were starting to move out on him a little bit. At wide receiver, Josh Reynolds ran around on 88% of dropbacks, had 28% target share, 36% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.67, which is pretty strong. An ADOT of 10.1. The only wide receiver with an ADOT over 10 was Van Jefferson in this game, who ran just 6 routes. So Josh Reynolds, with this still pretty shallow ADOT, was the deep threat in this game. And this is a consistent feature of this offense, where Reynolds and then Van Jefferson kind of sprinkling in are the only guys who ever really run anything remotely deep. And all the other guys work underneath, which makes Reynolds pretty interesting when the Rams have to go a little higher volume with their passing. Robert Woods in this game ran around on 83% of dropbacks, 17% of the targets, but just 5% of the air yards. Really gross ADOT in this game of 2.3. He had a whopper of 0.29. Cooper Kupp ran around on only 71% of dropbacks, so out there less than you would think. Target share of 19%, 22% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.44, an ADOT of 8.6. Both Kupp and Woods have ADOTs below 8 on the season. This is just the Rams offense. A normal offense would have Reynolds kind of as the deep threat with an ADOT of like 14, and then one of Kupp's or Woods. Let's say Kupp would be kind of around 10 or 11, and then maybe you have Woods operating underneath, and he's down kind of at like 6 to 8. But in this offense, you've got both Kupp and Woods operating at that range, sometimes lower, and then Reynolds operating at like an intermediate depth, but that counts as the deep threat. There's probably a Goff thing, not so much like a Woods, Reynolds, and Kupp thing, but the setup of this offense is going to cap, I think, the weekly upside of Kupp and Woods. Maybe they can still have some spike weeks, but it hurts when you don't have anybody opening up the offense. There's not a deep threat in this offense, so it's tough to see one of these guys like truly feasting underneath because basically everyone's running at the same depths. The only guy who really was kind of a deep threat in this game was Tyler Higbee, who had an ADOT of 12.7. He ran around on 56 or just on 50% of dropbacks. Target per route run of 29%, pretty nice. Elite weighted target per route run, right? Because he has a 12.78 ADOT to go with the 29% target per route run. Elite weighted target per route run of 0.78. Went 3 for 60. But, I think it's probably a spike week because he only ran half the routes. Gerald Everett ran 40% of the routes. Target per route run of 18%, which is solid. ADOT of 7.7. Solid weighted target per route run of 0.41. If this offense consolidated to one tight end, that tight end would be very valuable, but these guys are cannibalizing each other. I've said this a lot. I keep saying this. It is frustrating because you do see the flashes, and here we saw it with Higbee. I think Everett would be really good if Higbee was removed from the offense and vice versa. A reminder that Everett is a free agent after the season. So as we move into 2021, this could be the case where Higbee's out there as the solo starting tight end. And I do think he would be pretty valuable in that scenario. So definitely a sneaky dynasty target as people get more and more soured on Higbee to add any value this season. In Miami, Salvin Ahmed played 76% of the snaps, had a workload of 15.4 expected points, 87% of the expected points in the Miami Dolphins backfield this week. So pretty strong percentage here of the workload. Added 0.6 fantasy points over expectation, so didn't do too much efficiency-wise, but had a pretty big workload and played well. Scored a touchdown on 3 total green zone opportunities. Just 1 total target, which was a weakness of his game in college, so it could be game script dependent here. That said, Miami gets the Broncos and the Jets next, so I don't know that we need to be worried about the game script. It's not, you want the guy in those games who's going to be kind of the downhill rusher, not the receiving guy, not the receiving running back. So I do think Salvon Ahmed looking pretty interesting here, depending on when Myles Gaskin gets back. If possible, I think he's back for week 12, but if he ends up missing both week 11 and week 12, Salvon Ahmed could be pretty nice as a fill-in. Obviously, I was too low on him after last week. This week, he really solidified a big role in the offense. Patrick Laird played behind him with 17% of the snaps, had 1.5 expected points and 0.4 fantasy points over expectation. He had a 17-yard run. Patrick Laird now leads all running backs in breakaway percentage. 94.4% of his rushing yards are on breakaway rushes. Was that just that one rush? Yes, but praise the Laird. DeAndre Washington, he was part of the reason that I was too low on Ahmed, because I thought he would get a bigger role once given the chance. Maybe he works into a bigger role, but I'm kind of skeptical of that now after Ahmed played really nicely on a big role, and has been with the team since the preseason. DeAndre Washington only on 7% of the snaps, had a workload of just 0.9 points, left 0.7 of that on the field. So I don't think he ultimately wound up having much value. This guy, I keep chasing DeAndre Washington, thinking he's going to have value this year, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. At wide receiver, Devontae Parker ran a route on 96% of dropbacks, had 29% target share, 33% air yard share, wide receiver one type whopper of 0.67, an ADOT of 12.6. Just a beautiful wide receiver one profile, right? Getting that intermediate depth that we like, solidifying his role here with Preston Williams out. I think he looks like a really strong option when the Dolphins are going to be forced to pass. As I mentioned, probably not the next 2 weeks. They're not going to have to pass a ton. But, once we move past that, if it sets up for them or unexpectedly, they get in a shootout over the next couple of weeks, then Devontae Parker is a pretty strong option. You see here on the chart, right where we want him, looking like kind of a classic wide receiver one. Now that Preston Williams has been removed from the mix, and Preston Williams, briefly there looked like he might challenge for the wide receiver one. Jakeem Grant, more involved than I thought he might be, because I wasn't sure if he was going to translate to the Preston Williams role, but that's what he played this week. Ran around on 77% of dropbacks, 21% targets, 25% of the air yards, had a whopper of 0.49, an ADOT of 13.2. So again, getting targeted downfield, playing that Preston Williams role. Pretty interesting. I also think he's interesting if the Dolphins are in situations where they're forced to pass. As we move later into the season, keep your eye on Jakeem Grant. Probably get a couple more weeks to assess this role, see if it's really in place before you'd even want to use him. Malcolm Perry ran around on 54% of dropbacks, had 8% of the targets and 5% of the air yards, whopper 0.16, and 8 out of 6.5. He's an underneath slot wide receiver. Nothing really much to see there. At tight end, the man, the Smith, the legend, Durham Smythe, got in the end zone here, had an elite target per route run of 25%. Did only run a route on 31% of dropbacks, though. Adam Shaheen also had a target per route run of 25%, ran a route on 15% of dropbacks, and that'll wrap it up for Miami. I'm just kidding. Mike Gesicki, he is still the tight end one here, ran a route on 65% of dropbacks. He had an elite target per route run in this game of 29%. He had an elite weighted target per route run in this game, truly elite, of 0.88, a whopper of 0.52. These are all awesome numbers for a tight end. Nearly led the team in air yards this week, had 30% of the air yards. He had a 15.8 ADOT. That is very unusual for a tight end. He is and this is something I've talked about before. This is not something that's coming up for the first time. Mike Gesicki runs really deep routes. He's a deep threat. He's basically a deep threat wide receiver with tight end designation. Would I prefer that he was kind of like an intermediate wide receiver one with tight end designation like Darren Waller? Of course. But this is still pretty interesting when you get a guy who can have an 8 out of 15.8, almost lead his team in air yards and just get targeted at a super high rate. And then he's got tight end designation. So, yeah, I think that he does look like a tight end one option going forward. He's a guy that I think, again, if Miami is going to be forced to pass more, he looks pretty interesting as someone that you can consider for DFS. And certainly just given the state of tight end, pretty solid starting tight end option in your high-stakes leagues and what have you, because he's getting a really nice profile. It's just a highly, highly variant profile. And then we see Adam Shaheen and Smythe stealing enough that it hurts. But, Gesicki could pop off here for a really big game with that ADOT. In Minnesota, Dalvin Cook played 81% of the snaps. He had a workload of 21.1 expected points, an elite workload. He did leave a lot on the field this week, left 5.9 points out there. It's a tough matchup. Didn't convert his one green zone attempt. Still, didn't have a ton of goal line work and got a really nice workload. So a little bit of that Swift type of profile, a little bit of that James Robinson type of profile where, just being used as a total workhorse. With Cook, it's not a surprise. Don't really need to highlight it so much. We know he's a workhorse, but it wasn't a strong game for him fantasy-wise, really. But it did look pretty good in the underlying statistics here. He is set up to smash, I think, if the Vikings can control this week's game against Dallas, which you would think they could. I mean, even though their secondary is pretty bad, I'm not sure it's bad enough to let that game get away from what they want to do, which is run Dalvin Cook down the Cowboys' throats. Alexander Mattison barely involved here, just one expected point, and had 7% of the snaps. At wide receiver, Adam Thielen, he ran around on 100% of dropbacks, had 22% of the targets, had 22% of the air yards as well, a whopper of 0.48. That's okay. We would expect probably more from Thielen most weeks, an 8 out of 9.4, which is solid. Overall, kind of looked like a wide receiver 2 in this type of profile, but out there 100% of routes, which is nice. Justin Jefferson, kind of profiling as the wide receiver 1, he had a route on 95% of dropbacks, 31% of the targets, 40% of the air yards. He had a whopper of 0.75, which is a clear-cut wide receiver 1 type of level, an ADOT of 11.7, so he's getting that nice mix of target types. Had a much stronger week than Thielen in terms of the underlying volume, but Adam Thielen got in the end zone twice, so he ends up with a really strong day. Jefferson had a really strong day as well, but just didn't score. Kind of a wide receiver 1A, 1B situation. Justin Jefferson continues to be the most impressive rookie just in terms of the performances. I mentioned earlier, I think Higgins, his ability to emerge potentially as the clear-cut wide receiver 1 is arguably more impressive, but obviously what Justin Jefferson is doing in terms of earning targets, in terms of delivering efficiency, is just wild right now. Chad Beebe, he ran around the 41% of dropbacks, had 6% of the targets, 3% of the air yards, an 8 out of 4. Another one of these low volume, low upside slot wide receiver type dudes. At tight end, Kyle Rudolph, he ran a route on 78% of dropbacks, had 17% of the targets, had a targets per route run of 17%, which is okay. Not great. A whopper of 0.31. Rudolph here benefited from Irv Smith missing. Didn't have a great game, but had some usable production. It's interesting here that Tyler Conklin, he ran around on 65% of dropbacks. Again, with Rudolph, it's 78%. So the Vikings are committed to passing out of 2 tight end sets a lot, even if Irv Smith misses or if Rudolph were to miss and they still had Smith, and you'd expect them to continue doing the same thing. Conklin only had an 8% target per route run of 5.5 yards per target, so he can be ignored, but just kind of interesting that this offense is going to, I think, consistently be passing out of 2 tight end sets a lot. In New England, Damian Harris had 55% of the snaps and 11 expected points, 1.1 point over expectation. Rex Burkhead had 34% of the snaps, 10.8 expected points, 11.8 fantasy points over expectation. Had a really nice day getting in the end zone. Harris technically the lead back, but in terms of the workload, it was a 50-50 split, right? Harris with 55% of the snaps to 34% for Burkhead, but 11 expected points and 10.8 for Burkhead. So they're right there with the expected points. Burkhead, fourth among all running backs in fantasy points over expectation this season. He'll obviously regress substantially, but I don't think he's going away completely this year. He's played awesome. Seems to really have impacted James White's role in the offense. White only had 17% of the snaps, 2.9 expected points, played right at expectation, but just a very, very small workload, true backup rotational running back type of workload. At wide receiver, Jacoby Myers, this dude is basically the entire passing offense right now. Look at this chart. Look at this chart. Seriously, please go to the YouTube, subscribe, like, all that good stuff, but then look at this chart, because Jacoby Myers is the only wide receiver listed on this entire chart. And he's listed exactly where we want our wide receivers to be listed. He's listed as running a bunch of routes, ran a route on 89% of dropbacks. He was targeted at a very high rate, had 41% of the targets, and he was getting a good air yard share, 48% of the air yards. He had a 0.95 whopper, which is elite, a 0.94 weighted target per route run, which is elite. The other wide receivers didn't even get targeted in this game. Damiere Byrd ran around on 79% of dropbacks, but was not targeted, did not make the chart. N'Keal Harry ran around on 63% of dropbacks, was not targeted, did not make the chart. Ryan Izzo, he ran around on 42% of dropbacks. He got 13% target per route run. Really, really kind of gross dude you don't really have to worry about. So on this chart, you've got Izzo over here. You got Burkhead, you got White, you got Myers. You got 4 players in this entire offense. It's extremely condensed. I mean, condensed to the point that it's actually a problem. That's one of the reasons why New England isn't putting up a ton of points, is they don't really have playmakers. But Myers, I think, has made the case that he is a playmaker, and he is going to be a big, big part of this offense moving forward. I think no matter who ends up being out there week to week. Moving to New Orleans, Alvin Kamara, 66% of the snaps in this game, elite workload of 22.9 expected points, had really nice efficiency on this, 11.9 points over expectation. This is the classic Alvin Kamara combo that we got used to early in the season. Elite workload plus elite efficiency. The question now, right, is going to be, can Jameis Winston support this? I guess, can Jameis Winston be named the starter so we don't have to deal with him losing work to, kind of a fake quarterback, whatever wildcat quarterback kind of BS they're going to pull. But hopefully Jameis Winston will be named a starter. And I think he will be able to support this type of combination. Obviously, we need to see it, but I'm not that worried about Winston ruining this. But nice to see Kamara back to what we expect from him, the elite workload plus elite efficiency. One of the few running backs in the entire league that can deliver that combination on a consistent basis. Latavius Murray had 41% of the snaps, 4.2 expected points with 1.9 fantasy points over expectation. He got a lot of snaps in this game, but all the important work went to Kamara, including 3 green zone attempts, 1 green zone target, and 8 total targets, all going to Kamara. Obviously fairly typical, but nice to see. You want to see the good stuff going to Kamara like we expect. At wide receiver, Michael Thomas ran around on 100% of dropbacks, had a 30% target share, a 61% air yard share, a whopper of 0.89, which is an elite whopper. This was a classic Michael Thomas week in terms of the underlying volume. But we have 3 problems with this game, right? Michael Thomas, there was only 26 dropbacks. So only so much you can do with a huge share of 26 dropbacks. Who's also inefficient, had a yards per target of just 3.9. And then as we move forward, the third problem here is it's, again, unclear what his role is going to look like without Drew Brees. I am fairly optimistic, assuming we have Jameis Winston here. Winston's issue is that he tends to feed his best players to a fault, and Thomas remains head and shoulders the best player here at wide receiver. So I am optimistic on Thomas going forward. And don't get psyched out by this bad week on Thomas. He did have the underlying volume that we were looking for. If people are kind of scared off because of the change in quarterback, this could be an opportunity here with Michael Thomas. Emmanuel Sanders had 88% of the routes this week. Really gross week, though. He had an 8 out of 1. Target per route run of 4%. Just 4% of the targets, 1% of the air yards. Pretty gross. Traquan Smith knocked out of the game with a concussion. He had 38% of the targets, he ran a route on 38% of dropbacks because he was knocked out of the game, had 4% of the targets, just 5% of the air yards, used very shallowly in this game, which is unusual, but I think he only had 1 target. So not too much to take away from that. Deontay Harris ran around on 58% of the dropbacks. He had 17% target share, -3% air yards and ADOT behind the line of scrimmage of 0.8, -0.8. Jared Cook was kind of the deep threat in this game. Ran around on 69% of targets, had 11% target per route run, which is not very good, but an ADOT of 13. So his weighted target per route run was better, although still not very good at 0.31. I think it's something that he's the deep threat, and I think maybe he could benefit from Jameis Winston if Cook kind of has that deep threat role locked up. He does have an ADOT of 10.2 on the season, which is a bit deeper than usual for tight end, and it's the deepest ADOT on the Saints. So he does seem to be kind of the deep threat. Tre'Quan Smith would normally be that other guy, but if he ends up missing with this concussion, then Jared Cook could operate as the deep threat, which I think is more interesting, obviously, with Jameis Winston than it would be with Drew Brees. Moving to the Giants, Wayne Gallman had 59% of snaps, 19.8 expected points, left 0.8 of those on the field, so played pretty much at expectations. Turned 4 green zone rushes into 2 touchdowns. Otherwise didn't play so well, though. Went 18 for 53 on the ground. Had 2 targets, which he turned into 1 for 7. So, not a great game outside of the 2 touchdowns, but hey, 2 touchdowns, pretty nice. And had a pretty big lead both in snaps and especially in workload over Alfred Morris. Alfred Morris did play 21% of the snaps, so cut in somewhat there. Had 3.4 expected points. And then Dion Lewis had 20% of the snaps, so also cut in and had 3.3 expected points. So Gallman is losing, a decent amount of snaps. The snaps more concerning than the expected points, where he only lost a combined 6.7 expected points and got nearly 20 expected points himself, although he kind of has the reverse of the phenomena that I was talking about with DeAndre Swift and James Washington, where the expected points probably overstates the level of a workhorse that Gallman was, because he got the 4 green zone rushes, which is really going to boost his expected points workload, and probably overstates what he would have had the Giants not been able to get 4 green zone rushes, which they're not normally going to do. This is the Giants. So the more important thing here is that he got 59% of the snaps, which is good but not great. The 19.8 expected points, which is great, I think is a little bit misleading. Fullback Elijah Penny here also stole a green zone rush, just as a note. At wide receiver, Darius Slayton, he ran around 79% of dropbacks. Didn't run a full slate of routes here, but did regain the top role in the offense, which was nice to see, with 25% of the targets, 37% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.63. Had an ADOT of 12.6, getting back to that wide receiver 1 volume. He had a wide receiver 1 weighted target per route run of 0.73, and he was banged up early in this game, which is why he didn't run a full slate of routes, so it wasn't like a deployment thing. So all in all, very, very solid week, very kind of strong bounce back week for Darius Slayton on a per route run basis, really looking like a wide receiver 1. So that's all really nice to see. After last week, he wasn't getting the underlying volume the way we've come to expect. Sterling Shepard, just very, very consistent here, ran around on 94% of dropbacks, had 21% of the targets, 17% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.44. This is, he's kind of a co-wide receiver 1, I guess, or kind of the wide receiver 1B, but delivering consistent production. Lacks upside, I think. He's in a bad offense. He's got a low ADOT, 6.7 this week, but definitely pretty consistent, which you got to give him credit for. Golden Tate, he was back this week and ran around on 52% of dropbacks. I think his return probably helps Darius Slayton, and it may help Sterling Shepard as well. He had a similar ADOT to Slayton of 11.8, but he's clearly a far worse player than Slayton, and it's unclear to me why Tate is even playing ahead of Austin Mack. Austin Mack kind of flashed a little bit, and I think it's good. It's good for Slayton if he doesn't have to contend with another guy who can really draw targets. Golden Tate didn't play too bad this week. I may be overstating it a little bit. He had 18% of the targets, 25% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.44. I guess I'm just kind of more annoyed that I thought maybe we might not have to deal with Golden Tate anymore and get someone new and interesting, and it's Golden Tate again. At tight end, Evan Ingram, he ran around on 85% of dropbacks, had a target per route run of 11%, an ADOT of 7.7, which is pretty solid. We've dealt with Ingram down really, really low this season, so at least he wasn't there. But a yards per target of just 5, so the per target efficiency isn't there. And that's going to be something that we have to deal with because he's in the Giants. But, on the season, he is really struggling this year. He's running a lot of routes, which is nice. He runs a lot more routes than a typical tight end. And that's something that we normally do see from Evan Ingram. But he has a target per route run of just 18.4%, which isn't terrible, but definitely below where we'd want. And a 5.7 yards per target, which is pretty much terrible. I would expect the yards per target to come up some. That's not something that's sticky. And Evan Ingram, I don't think is terrible. He almost had a really, really nice catch in this game, but was out of bounds. So he should start to deliver a little bit more efficiently on his targets. But I don't know that he's going to start earning targets at a much higher rate. And that's something that was a red flag entering the season, that he hadn't been earning targets at a really high rate. So I don't have a ton of confidence in Evan Ingram as we move forward, although certainly he could deliver some spike weeks, especially if the ADOT stays above where it was. That really low ADOT was hurting him earlier in the season, and so that's been a nice development to see him kind of moving in the right direction there. Moving to Philadelphia, Miles Sanders played 72% of the snaps, had 15.9 expected points, slightly under-delivered that with minus 2.4 points over expectation. Boston Scott, he had 27% of the snaps, just 2.7 expected points, just 3 attempts and only 1 target, but had a 56-yard touchdown run, right? Almost stepped out of bounds. I have Sanders in some leagues. I have Sanders. I had Sanders this week in DFS, so I was really hoping that they would reverse that and maybe Sanders would get a chance to score the touchdown. But, you can't take that away from Boston Scott. It was a really nice run. Scott, as a result, added 11.7 points in efficiency to his 2.7-point workload. Can't take that away from Scott. Can we take away the goal line carry from Corey Clement, though? That would be nice. He had one snap in this game, and it was a goal line carry. He had 1.4 expected points on that carry, got in the end zone, though, so delivered the additional 5.1 points there. Absolutely tilting. Literally was screaming at the TV when Corey Clement, when I saw his number instead of Miles Sanders. Inexplicable, unexpected, tilting as hell. At wide receiver, Jalen Reagor ran around on 93% of dropbacks, got 19% of the targets, 28% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.49. He had an 8 out of 13.7. So, kind of a deep threat type of role, but not so deep that it's going to lead to wild inconsistency, still getting some intermediate stuff. Yards per target of 6.7, which is both bad, but also led all Eagles wide receivers this week. So wouldn't expect him, he actually stood out in a good way, even with a bad yards per target. Overall, I think this was a pretty bullish week for Reagor. As we look at the chart here, you see there is no wide receiver where we want, but Rager's the closest. Didn't get targeted on a high enough percentage of his routes, but getting used somewhat deep, so had decent air yard share. I think that, as we look at his routes run, consider the fact that Alshon Jeffrey was back this week. Alshon Jeffrey ran a route on 37% of dropbacks, but that didn't impact Jalen Reagor at all. Reagor was out there for 93%. So Reagor does look like the wide receiver 1 in terms of playing time right now. And over the last 2 weeks, he has 13 targets to Travis Fulgham's 12. So, they're basically right there, neck and neck. But the coaching staff seems to be favoring Jalen Reagor, giving him 93% of the routes, where Fulgham was running around on 83% of dropbacks. I believe the snap counts were basically identical, but obviously they're wide receivers, so we care more about the routes run. Travis Fulgham with 83% there, 14% of the targets, 22% of air yards, a whopper of 0.36. Interestingly, an 8 out of 15. He had been kind of more in the intermediate range previously, so he was a deep threat this week, which was a bit unexpected, even deeper than Reagor. Greg Ward ran around on 56% of dropbacks. He had a 17% target share, 2% air yard share, 1.3 ADOT, low upside slot wide receiver from Greg Ward. Don't need to worry about him. Alshon Jeffrey, he had a 0.21 weighted target per route run. So even in a small role, didn't really look interesting. On a per route basis, not excited about him. You see him on the chart. He's in a spot where we can kind of ignore guys, where you tend to see some of these tight ends that I keep saying to ignore. So I'm hoping that Jeffrey, they're talking about him playing more. I really don't want him to. Maybe he plays more at the expense of one of the tight ends, because they do run some 2 tight end stuff. Maybe they run some 4 wide stuff, or maybe he's playing ahead of Greg Ward, and then Fulgham or Reagor kicks into the slot. But I really do not want Jeffrey hurting Fulgham or Reagor, who I think are just clearly better at this point. At tight end, Dallas Goedert ran around on 83% of dropbacks, had a target per route run of 18%, which isn't great, but not terrible. An 8 out of 9.8, which is somewhat deep for tight end, and so his weighted target per route run was solid at 0.44. Not a great game for Goedert, but the underlying volume wasn't terrible. Richard Rodgers, interesting that he was involved so much when on the field. He only ran a route on 27% of dropbacks, but targeted on 45% of his routes, had an 8 out of 11.6, a weighted target per route run of 1.2. This is a scale that's supposed to go to 1. So Rodgers getting targeted at an extremely high rate, and with some air yards to go with it when out on the field. He's actually been really good this year on a per route basis, but he is getting the playing time of a pure backup tight end. So this is not the Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert situation where Rodgers is in the Goedert role. He is, definitely playing like a backup tight end. But I do think that his strong day is a reminder that Carson Wentz does like throwing to the tight end. And in a weird way, I think it's probably bullish for Goedert. Goedert should be in for much bigger days with the amount of routes that he's running, and a quarterback who likes to throw to the tight end. I think in this game, some of the stuff that we can normally expect to go to Goedert happened to go to Richard Rodgers. That said, I don't want to take this away from Richard Rodgers. If he were to get more playing time, I would be interested. He is looking really nice on a per route basis. Moving to Pittsburgh, James Conner played 88% of the snaps, which is an elite snap share and something that we have been a little bit concerned about over the past few weeks. However, he only had a workload of 9.5 expected points. He left 2.7 points out on the field. So the value wasn't there in terms of, delivering. The value in the backfield just wasn't there. It's not like someone else got a bunch of expected points. Benny Snell only had 1.7. Ray McLeod is kind of this wide receiver running back combo player, had 4.3 expected points, so he stole a little bit, and he actually did have a green zone carry. So that hurt. But for the most part, the issue here was that there just wasn't a ton of value in this backfield. Makes Conner, I think, pretty interesting heading into Jacksonville, because they keep not delivering strong value to the backfield in matchups where you think that the Steelers might. But James Conner with this 88% snap share, that was his highest snap share of the season. It's an elite snap share. So I do think that a little bit of a hold your nose play with Conner as he gets another nice matchup here coming off his highest snaps of the season. Benny Snell, as I mentioned, only 1.7 expected points, left a half a point on the field, only had 5% of the snaps. But Anthony McFarland was a healthy scratch here. He was a scratch. I don't think it was injury related. And so Benny Snell maybe is the backup again. I can't keep track here, right? It keeps bouncing back and forth. I think they're not even sure. Jalen Samuels got 1% of the snaps. And as I mentioned, Ray McLeod also involved. He left 2.6 points on the field. He played 21% of the snaps. At wide receiver, or I do want to mention actually, Terrell Edmonds was also active. So they had Conner, Snell, McLeod, Samuels, and Edmonds all active, but not Anthony McFarland. Kind of weird. At wide receiver, Juju Smith-Schuster ran a route on 98% of dropbacks. He had 28% of the targets, 20% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.56, and an 8 out of 6.5, so still playing that underneath role. But the underlying volume here was pretty strong this week. You see him on the chart. That's where we want to see guys. We know that Juju plays mostly out of the slot. He's going to have a shallower A-dot. And so what we want is a really high target rate. We got that this week, and it's something that has improved after a really, really slow start to the season. I wonder if some of this was health related. I've been kind of willing to bail out here on Juju, particularly on Dynasty, because he is a free agent at the end of the year, so it's concerning when a guy's struggling and then he might have to change teams, negotiate a new contract, negotiate a new role, et cetera, play his way into a new role. And this is all looking a bit better for Juju over the last few weeks. That said, it's looking good for the other guys too. Deontay Johnson ran around on 93% of dropbacks. He had 24% of the targets, 27% of the air yards, a .55 whopper, so right there with Juju. And he had an ADOT a little bit deeper, more in that intermediate range of 10.5, kind of the primary wide receiver depth type of ADOT. And he continues to profile with this, 0.55 whopper, nice intermediate depth ADOT, getting, running a bunch of routes, continues to profile like kind of a classic wide receiver one. And then you have Chase Claypool, who's profiling as the emerging potential star, which is, that's not shocking anybody at this point. But the part that I think should be maybe a little shocking is that he's still emerging. Like, the guy has proven, at least in my mind, that he should be out there all the time. He only ran around on 63% of dropbacks in this game, had 22% of the targets, 41% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.62. So the best whopper of these three, yet only out there for 63% of dropbacks compared to 98% for Juju and 93% for Deontay Johnson. 17.8 ADOT for Claypool, so he's kind of the classic deep threat wide receiver. Get this dude on the field more. On a per route basis, he is dominant. His weighted target per route run is 1.09. Seems pretty clear to me that Chase Claypool is the Steelers wide receiver to own long term. It's frustrating that he's not running routes on the same level of Juju and Johnson, despite earning better volume while being out there less. But part of the problem here is James Washington, who continues to be involved. I think this will eventually stop being the case. It just doesn't really make sense that James Washington is out there as much as he is. But this week, ran around on 41% of dropbacks, had 4% of the targets, 4% of the air yards, not doing anything with his routes. And so you would think that eventually some of those go to Claypool. Over the last 4 weeks, by the way, we have like a very, very close split in whopper. So this is kind of what I was talking about with Juju Smith-Schuster's volume getting better. Has a whopper over the last 4 weeks of 0.53. Deontay Johnson is at 0.53, and Chase Claypool at 0.51. However, Johnson has been dealing on and off with injuries, and Claypool is not getting a full slate of routes, and Juju is almost always running nearly 100% of routes. So I still think Juju's a sell. I think that, you should ask for more back. His value, I think, has increased some, but overall, I think there's still some downside risk here. He's got two wide receivers behind him who look like potential stars, and he is out there all the time running a bunch of routes on a per route basis. He doesn't look overly impressive. So while things have definitely gotten better for Juju, I still think he is. I do lean sell. I don't lean. I still think Juju's a sell. At tight end, Eric Ebron ran around on 85% of dropbacks, had 13% target per route run, an 8 out of 6.7. Not a strong day for Ebron, but, as I've talked about with some of these other tight ends, when a guy's running this many routes, that alone can make him a viable kind of tight end starter. In San Francisco, Jerick McKinnon played 62% of snaps, had 14.9 expected points, left 9.3 points on the field. So really disappointed here. JaMychal Hasty broke his collarbone in this game, played 21% of the snaps, and had just 4 expected points. Austin Walter was looks like the next guy up, at least in this game, had 17% of the snaps, had 1.9 expected points with 2.1 fantasy points over expectation. Tevin Coleman, I think, might be back here after the Week 11 bye, so I'm not sure how interesting Walter is, but certainly might be worth like $1 ad or something. And Mostert obviously also might be back. So, I don't know, maybe Walter, if you don't have the space to hold him through the bye week, then we probably won't end up picking him up, I don't think, in our FFPC stuff, but thought I'd mention it, that he was the guy who got mixed in a little bit here. Coleman looking more interesting, though, right? Because if Mostert doesn't come back after the Week 11 bye, then Tevin Coleman could have a pretty big role, especially with how inefficient Jerick McKinnon was in this game. So if he's available on waivers anywhere, I think he's definitely worth an ad. At wide receiver, Brandon Ayuk. The 49ers were not messing around this week with Brandon Ayuk. He ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. He had 36% of the targets, 37% of the air yards. He had a whopper of 0.8, which is alpha wide receiver territory. He had a 6.1 ADOT, so kind of in this Deebo Samuel plus role, getting some of that underneath Deebo Samuel stuff. But we've also seen Brandon Ayuk operate in a deep threat role, so we know he's very versatile. Really nice to see him just getting fed in this game. He got 14 targets, delivered 7 for 75 and a score. His yards per target was only 6.8, so not great, but enough to lead all 49ers wide receivers. So definitely rewarded the 49ers for feeding him here compared to their other options at least. Richie James, he ran a route on 93% of dropbacks. He had a 13% target share, 28% air yard share, and a whopper of 0.39. An ADOT here of 12.6. He was basically in what had been the Ayuk role when Deebo Samuel was in the lineup, kind of more in that pure deep threat role. Didn't lead to too much. Kendrick Bourne, he ran around 69% of dropbacks, 13% target share, 7% air yard share, and an ADOT of 3. Kind of low upside, low volume. At tight end, Jordan Reed looks to be pretty interesting here. Ran around on 52% of dropbacks, had a 27% target per route run, which is an elite mark, an ADOT of 7.5, which is pretty solid. He is trending towards becoming a very strong tight end play for as long as Kittle is out. Ross Dwelley saw his routes fall back. He ran a route on 43% of dropbacks, had a 6% target per route run. He's a blocking tight end, and I think he's likely to stop running so many routes now that Reed is starting to get back to full health. Moving to Seattle, Alex Collins played 48% of the snaps. He had 8.1 expected points, 3.6 points over expectation. DJ Dallas played 33% of the snaps. He had 4 expected points with 1.1 point over expectation. Travis Homer had just 10% of the snaps, although he did get 4.5 expected points, more than you would have thought based on the snap count. And he had 0.4 points over expectation. So Collins got about half the snaps and about half the expected points. He looks like the best option here if Hyde and Carson were to miss again in Week 11. At wide receiver, DK Metcalf ran around on 96% of dropbacks, had 11% of the targets, 21% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.32. He had an ADOT of 19.2, so clear-cut deep threat in this game, but obviously didn't get a lot of volume with just, this low whopper of 0.32, and even on a per route run basis, not very strong at 0.27. A lot of Jalen Ramsey this week. I think that's probably part of the reason why he struggled to earn targets. Should bounce back pretty quickly here. Tyler Lockett, he ran a route on 88% of dropbacks, had 26% of the targets, 43% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.68. So pretty strong week in terms of volume. He, as you see here on the chart, was not targeted at a super high rate, but had an ADOT of 17.3, so got lots of air yards with 43% share. A yards per target of only 7.3, though, which isn't terrible, but, would have been nice to see him take advantage of the coverage on Metcalf and the volume that he got and pair that with a strong yards per target for a big day. David Moore ran around on 59% of dropbacks. He had 9% of the targets, 1% of the air yards, and 8 out of 1.7. Wasn't really in his typical big play role. We got a little bit of action here from Freddie Swing this week with 39% of the routes, 11% of the targets, 9% of the air yards. Moore is still the dart throw here over Swain. Interesting that Swain was involved, though. At tight end, it was not Jacob Hollister week. He ran a route on 8% of dropbacks, just 8%. It's unclear why it wasn't Jacob Hollister week, though, because Greg Olsen ran a route on 67% of dropbacks, and he had a target per route run of 12%, which is really gross. He had a weighted target per route run of 0.29, which is gross. Get this dude off the field already. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Obviously, it was just noise that Hollister got as many routes as he did, but it should not have been noise because Greg Olsen is garbage. Moving to Tampa Bay. At running back, Ronald Jones, 59% of the snaps. He had 18.2 expected points, 8.6 points over expectation. Didn't convert on 4 green zone attempts, but did score from 98 yards out. Kind of interesting, right? He gets 18.2 expected points, but, doesn't convert those, but does score from deep. Leonard Fournette here had 36% of the snaps, 9.7 expected points, left 4.7 points out on the field, and had 1 green zone target, 2 green zone attempts. LaShawn McCoy sighting, don't like to see that, 4% of the snaps. I think that was probably just a garbage time thing. And yeah, look, I mean, when you run for a 98-yard touchdown, that's going to be the story. But I'm not sure that's really the story here, right? Because while that run was pure joy, it's also that Jones fumbled early in this game and then went on to have a borderline elite workload of 18.2 expected points. He had 23 attempts in this game. He had 192 yards and a score. That includes those 4 green zone rushes that I mentioned. It also includes 2 targets for 1 catch for 6 yards. The receiving role here is limited, but it is at least consistent, and he's usually getting at least a little bit every week. Fournette, had very valuable work as well, stealing 9.7 expected points. But, Jones could have had a very strong day even without the 98-yard run, right? Like, take away the 98-yard run and have him cash in on some of the goal line stuff, and he gets there anyway. So I guess you could say, well, he stinks because he didn't score on the goal line stuff. But this guy who had a 98-yard run in the same game. So it's kind of one of those things where the efficiency and the variance worked against him on the one hand, and then it really worked for him on the other hand. I think overall, my take on Jones right now is that he's profiling similarly to Josh Jacobs. He needs the right game script to really deliver. And then even then, he's unlikely to go nuclear because he loses too many valuable snaps. But he also has strong enough touchdown equity and enough receiving juice to where he's not going to just leave you with 3 points. At the same time, Josh Jacobs is a little bit of a bullish comparison because Jones is going to struggle to have the consistent near elite level workloads that we generally expect from Josh Jacobs in the right scripts. But it's a similar profile where we need the right script to set up, and then we need the guys behind him not to steal too much, even though we know they're going to steal some. So, are we getting these right scripts? We are. His playoff schedule, Tampa Bay's playoff schedule for the fantasy playoffs is home for Minnesota, at Atlanta, and at Detroit. So I hope you guys are on it. At wide receiver, Mike Evans, he ran a route on 95% of dropbacks. He had 29% of the targets, 30% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.64, and an 8 out of 8.7. Pretty strong roll this week. 11 targets for 6 receptions, 77 yards, and a touchdown. It's going to be hard to count on given how spread out the targets are here, but at least they do look for Evans in the red zone, and that seems to be pretty consistent. Chris Godwin ran a route on 93% of dropbacks. He had 16% of the targets, 14% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.33. He had an 8 out of 7.5. All the Tampa Bay wide receivers are below 10 this week, but Godwin was the most shallow of the 3 main wide receivers. I think that's a little bit of a problem if the volume isn't going to be high. You see him here, kind of profiling like the Larry Fitzgerald style role this week. Not really all that valuable of a role, at least this week. Antonio Brown, part of the reason why, he ran around 63% of dropbacks, had 21% of the air yards, 21% of the targets, 23% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.48. Not great, but on a per route basis, he was looking like a wide receiver 1 with a 0.75 weighted target per route run. Brady loves throwing to this guy. I think luckily for Evans and Godwin, Brown isn't on the field all the time. But if that changes and if Brown starts to get out on the field more, it's really going to hurt Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, and Brown could finally pay off. He's been kind of this controversial player on ship taking where the chat loves him. Henry Muto, one of the better high-stakes players. He's like first in the main event right now overall, I think, or at least he was last week. Hopefully he stayed. He's big on Antonio Brown, so some really sharp guys are on him, but me and Pete have just not been on him. If he gets out there more, he's profiling like, what did I say with this chart, right? When we see guys in this exact part of the chart, we're supposed to pay attention. If there's a reason I think they might run more routes, and as much as I hate to say it, that is the exact situation that Antonio Brown is in. You would probably expect him to run more routes going forward. Tyler Johnson and Scotty Miller were both mixed in this week. So you could, that's where those routes come from. It doesn't even necessarily have to come from Evans and Godwin. At tight end, Rob Gronkowski, he ran around 76% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 10%, which is really bad, but an 8 out of 22.7. So he was the deep threat this week, right? All the wide receivers are below 10. Gronk was the deep threat. That's something that we saw from time to time in New England. Scored a touchdown. His weighted target per route run of 0.34 wasn't bad. So, not targeted at a high rate, but getting those air yards, which matters. Cameron Brate stole a touchdown in this game. He had a 23% target per route run, only ran a route on 32% of dropbacks, though. So not really interesting. Probably just kind of hurts Gronk, but were Gronk to miss time, I think Cameron Brate would be kind of interesting. Moving to running back, moving to Tennessee, Derrick Henry had 58% of the snaps, 14.2 expected points, left 2.3 points on the field, had just one green zone attempt that he didn't convert. Jeremy McNichols had 26% of the snaps, 2.7 expected points, had 1.7 points in efficiency. And Deontay Foreman, he had 14% of the snaps, 5.2 expected points, more than you would have thought based on the snaps, and 4.1 points over expectation. Foreman is getting work when he's out there, and he's playing well. I think he's a perfect breather back for Derrick Henry, kind of a similar mold, although a little bit smaller. And I legitimately am starting to think he's going to be a problem for Henry. This week, he stole a green zone target and scored on it. And I think Henry is kind of starting to look a little bit more like Josh Jacobs, right? Where he now has 3 straight weeks below 60% snaps. And he's in a situation where we do want him to be in the right game scripts. But now we're to a point where even when he's in the right game scripts, we're going to have Foreman probably stealing enough to hurt. Foreman kind of playing the Devontae Booker, Jeremy McNichols playing the Jalen Richard, if you think about it that way. And so in some ways, maybe he's a better direct comp to Josh Jacobs because you can see the ceiling. You would expect his workload to be more consistently between 15 and 20, like we generally would for Jacobs. Let's put it this way. Henry's probably the rich man's Jacobs. Jones profiling as the poor man's Jacobs. Jacobs, just as Jacobs. So, yeah, but that's not what we were supposed to have here with Derrick Henry. We're supposed to have an elite running back, and for a while it really looked like he was. But the emergence of Deontay Foreman stealing enough work on top of Jeremy McNichols stealing, 26% of the snaps, it's not ideal. At wide receiver, A.J. Brown ran around on 87% of dropbacks, had 15% of the targets, 23% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.39, an ADOT of 10.8. He dropped what would have been a long touchdown, probably a touchdown, would have definitely been a long gainer. But so that really hurt. But on the underlying stats, not so great, and was clearly the wide receiver 2 in volume this week. So it kind of makes sense that he had that dud. Now tied with Corey Davis in weighted target per route run for the season. So these guys are looking very much like a 1A, 1B co-wide receiver 1 type of situation here. Corey Davis, he ran around 73% of dropbacks, had 22% of targets, 34% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.57, which is kind of borderline wide receiver 1 level. He had an ADOT of 10.3, so used pretty similarly in terms of depth as A.J. Brown. And the situation overall is starting to resemble the Texans. We have two wide receiver ones here, basically. I think because Brown is so efficient, they could both pop in the same week if the Titans are forced to throw. The difference between this situation and the Texans, though, is that the tight end is also involved. Jonnu Smith ran around on 77% of dropbacks and was targeted at a high rate. He had 26% target per route run, and kind of came back to life a little bit after a few down weeks, not getting targets. Anthony Ferkshire was really out targeting him for a little bit there, but Jonnu Smith earned targets at a nice high rate once again. However, did not translate to the box score because he had a yards per target of just 2.3. Anthony Ferkshire was also very inefficient in this game with a yards per target of just 1.7. He, though, was targeted at a high rate as well, getting a target on 20% of his routes and ran a route on 50% of dropbacks. So this has been kind of the deployment here with Adam Humphries out, where you're getting two tight end sets in passing situations for the Titans. Curious to see if this keeps up with Adam Humphries returning, but I think it's worked out okay, although both these guys just collapsing in the yards per target this week might lead you to think that Adam Humphries is able to earn his way back pretty quickly. In Washington, J.D. McKissic, he played 70% of the snaps and had 31.4 expected points. This was the biggest workload of all running backs in Week 10, okay? However, J.D. McKissic left 13.5 points on the field. Okay, he was inefficient to the tune of 13.5 points below expectations. This was the worst efficiency among all running backs this week. Biggest workload, worst efficiency. Over the last 2 weeks now, McKissic has a workload of 55.5 points. He should be scoring like Alvin Kamara, but instead he's left 20.4 points on the field. He has had an absurd 15 targets this week to go with 14 last week, so a total of 29 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's playing this extremely valuable hybrid running back wide receiver role, but he's doing it extremely poorly. Something has to give here. If only there was a converted wide receiver who also played running back for this team. If only, oh wait, Antonio Gibson, he's right there, yet only 38% of the snaps this week, 14.8 expected points, which isn't bad, but I mean, they're giving 31.4 to McKissic. Maybe slide some of those over to Gibson, who played really well. He had 7.7 points over expectation, converted both of his green zone attempts. So continues to be very, very frustrating that Gibson isn't getting more of this work going to McKissic. However, I do think for the long term, this is bullish for Gibson to see this type of value in a backfield and having a lot of it go to a journeyman player who could easily cede that work to someone else and who was playing very, very efficiently, kind of loudly stating that he should not have this much work. And then you have a rookie who has been earning more and more work each week. They're kind of building up what they're asking him to take on. I mean, this is profiling like a guy who could develop into an absolute fantasy star because, even if Gibson was performing moderately inefficiently, on what McKissic was getting, we would have a role here that would yield the most valuable running back in fantasy over the last 2 weeks. So, and I think Gibson can do that. If he gets the type of workload that puts him in a position where he's getting 55.5 expected points over a 2 week period, you don't need to even deliver on all those 55.5 points. You just don't leave 20 of them on the field, right? And I think Gibson could more than do that. So as we look forward with Gibson, it's very easy to see how he ends up becoming just an elite fantasy running back, a truly elite running back one. I think that's in the cards with him. You don't really have to squint that hard to see it happening. Again, he is a converted wide receiver. This would fit him perfectly. I understand why they don't necessarily want to just have the offense run through this rookie. Maybe they don't feel he's quite there yet, but soon, potentially later this season, maybe next season, he could be in for just a massive role. This is probably your last chance to get Antonio Gibson. Obviously, it's going to feel like an overpay with him coming off a multiple touchdown week. But hey, this could look like a massive buying window where the guy thinks he's selling high off the 2 touchdowns and you're actually buying low off a workload that could be massive down the line. At wide receiver, Terry McLaurin ran around on 98% of dropbacks, had a 17% target share, a 21% air yard share, an ADOT of 7.6. So not really a deep threat this week, and we've seen that from McLaurin where he's not always a deep threat, and I think that's smart. I think this coaching staff recognizes that he's their best player. They need him to get him the ball. They don't necessarily need him to be running deep downfield. They can have other guys do that if necessary. And this week, Cam Sims kind of played that role a little bit with an 11 ADOT, the deepest of the wide receivers. Not a true deep threat here, but, ran deeper, substantially deeper than Terry McLaurin and the deepest of all the wide receivers. Ran a route on 95% of dropbacks, 9% of targets, 17% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.26. So not really that interesting, kind of helping keep things open for other players, really more than providing value on his own. Steven Sims ran around on 53% of dropbacks, had an ADOT of just 5.2, 11% of the targets, 8% of the air yards. So someone that you can ignore, again, one of these low upside slot guys. And then finally, to close things out here, at tight end, Logan Thomas had 98% ran around on 98% of dropbacks. This does not happen at tight end typically. 98% of dropbacks. This is like where some of the top end wide receivers are. Juju Smith-Schuster is usually up in this range. You see Michael Gallup typically up close to 100%. You saw Will Fuller, Brandon Cooks up at 100%. But normally among wide receivers, we're seeing them in the 80s to the low 90s. So to see Logan Thomas up at 98%, it's absurd for a tight end. He's basically a wide receiver with tight end eligibility at this point. He just doesn't get targeted, so he's just not a very good wide receiver. He got a target per route run of 9%, which is really gross. He had an ADOT of 12.3, which again is kind of more of a wide receiver type ADOT than a tight end. So his weighted target per route run of 0.25 was not as bad, but it was still bad. So, Logan Thomas, it's frustrating because there's a lot here in terms of the routes run. This is a situation we almost never get, yet he's not able to take advantage of it. So he is kind of closer to Ian Thomas than someone you're psyched to start, but just based on the routes run alone, he's someone that, you can consider throwing into your season long. I played him in DFS last week, didn't even really regret it because tight end was so gross. So, you gotta just recognize that he's running that many routes and good things can happen, but not going to really produce elite fantasy production just because when guys don't get targeted like this, that tends to be pretty sticky. All right, so that'll cover for this week. Make sure to tune into regularly scheduled ship chasing at 9:15 Eastern on Wednesday night. If you're listening to this on the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Once we get to 1,000 subscribers there, we are going to start releasing this at the same time as it goes up on YouTube. This goes up on YouTube Tuesday evening, and we don't release it until like Wednesday afternoon, typically on the podcast. So it's like a full 24 hours you get. If we can get this YouTube channel here up to 1,000 subscribers, that allows us to monetize it and allows us to like embed videos and do some other stuff. So just a big help there if you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Obviously, if you can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, that's also awesome. And we will see you guys on Wednesday.